I just got back from the 2024 Toronto International Film Festival. It was the first time I have ever attended TIFF, and I saw over 37 movies, technically 38 because I rewatched one movie, which we'll get into, but that means I got to see a lot of the biggest Oscar contenders for this year, including some movies that won't come out until 2025. So I have seen movies like Anora, The Brutalist, We Live in Time, Queer, Megalopolis, Nightb, Bird, Saturday Night, Heretic, Emilia, Perez, Babygirl, The Seed of the Sacred Fig, The Life of Chuck, Conclave, Flow, and Piece by Piece, The Piano Lesson, Hold Your Breath, The Order. There are just so many movies that are coming out that I get to talk about for you guys. It's a great mix of genre stuff. We got some good horror movies here. It's a great mix of the best picture stuff, hopefully, and a great mix of some of the worst movies I've seen all year, and I can't wait to talk about all of them here. And at first I was gonna give you a short video recapping everything I saw, but that's not how we do it on this channel. I wanna give you my full breakdown of everything I thought about these movies while they're still fresh in my mind. I will avoid spoilers at pretty much all costs. Like, some people swear they're not gonna spoil anything, and then they say, oh yeah, the ending was really depressing. So when you're watching the movie, all you're gonna think about later is, man, I can totally see where this movie's gonna go. And I hate watching reviews like that, so I promise you, to the best of my ability, I'm not gonna do any of that in this whole podcast slash video. Spoiler alert, there is a podcast coming, but it's gonna be probably a couple weeks. This is the first and last time you're gonna see this room on camera because I am moving over the next week, so my life has been super busy over the past 2 months. It's gonna continue to be busy for another 2 or 3 weeks. As you can see, I've officially moved into my new place. I'm still trying to put a studio somewhat together, but this video is very long. It's taken me about a month to actually get done. For some genius reason, I thought a video that's going to be pretty much around 2 hours long could be written, filmed, and edited in a very short timeline when I have so much other stuff going on, like a big move, moving in between 2 hurricanes, working on my business, planning other videos for this channel, getting 150 hours of work done at my seasonal job. I just decided to do all of this in the same month of my life for some reason. And on top of all of this, the other day I recorded 2 hours of this video without pressing the record button on my Rodecaster. It's the most amateur mistake I've made in like 5 years, and I was just so defeated by that for the day. And most YouTubers would put that piece of content out anyway with that bad audio, but that's not me. I go back and I act like I haven't said this yet. So it's been the 2 busiest months of my life in quite a while, so I'm sorry it took so long to put this piece of content out for you guys, but I promise you it's well worth it. I put a lot of effort into it, and so did Reed, the editor of this video. I knew with all this stuff going on, I needed as much editing help as possible, and he's been super patient with me as I just keep pushing this back a little bit by little, but he has assembled pretty much this entire thing, and thank you, Reed, for that. You can see his social media on screen now, so if you need help with editing and you like how this video is edited, please hit him up. He needs more work because he helped me out a ton here. So with all that being said, we have an absolutely epic video for you guys to enjoy today, so I hope you're seated, you're on a walk, you're on a run, you're on a commute to work, whatever it is. I hope you love talking about movies with me today, and yeah, let's just go back to my old apartment for a little bit. But there is a lot of great content coming to the channel, so if you haven't subscribed already, if you're just tuning in for some new TIFF content, I'm Chase. Welcome to the channel. And to the 11,000 of you that have supported the channel already in any sort of way, thank you so much. Because this was the first time in my life I got to attend a film festival as press, which means I got to see a lot of screenings for free, and it saved me so much money to the point where I probably wouldn't have been able to go this year if you guys hadn't supported the channel and TIFF was kind enough to invite me to cover the festival. It is such a huge milestone for me because the film festival has been on my radar for so long. It's been a huge bucket list item. And I grew up in South Jersey, so I wasn't technically that close to New York growing up. And now I live in Florida, which doesn't have a ton of film festivals like TIFF or the New York Film Festival or the Chicago Film Festival, where they get a lot of these movies in October. I just don't have the luxury of doing that. So being able to go to a film festival like TIFF and see all these movies as early as humanly possible, I'm always so upset at the end of the year because I wait to do my top 10 list because all of the biggest, best movies go to these film festivals. But if you live in an area like I do, you don't get the movie until like mid or late January, which always sucks. So for the first time, being able to be involved in these conversations already because I've seen the actual movies is such a blessing, and I truly mean thank you so much to you watching, because without you, I would not have been able to do this for the first time, and I can't wait to hopefully go back again next year. And let me just say, the TIFF experience was absolutely awesome. The only other film festival I have ever done in person is Sundance, and I love Sundance. Sundance is perfect for exploring new creative directors who are just kind of experimenting and trying to get their foot in the door in the industry, and that's where you discover a movie like Whiplash, Call Me By Your Name, Hereditary, Reservoir Dogs. You know, there's so many classic movies that premiered at Sundance, but there's a lot of bussing around and trying to figure out your schedule, and it's a lot more time consuming to do certain things. Versus TIFF, you are on like a 2 or 3 block radius and everything is there, and the entire city just feels like a movie lover paradise. Like, I felt like I was at my version of Disney World out there. I didn't know a lot of people going into the festival. Like, I did know Zach from the Intercut podcast. I knew Amanda the Jedi. I knew Zach's girlfriend Caitlin. Those were people I had stayed with before at Sundance, so it was great catching up with them. Then I ran into people I knew, like Brian Sudfield, who was just like, holy shit, you're here? And I'm like, yeah, I guess I am. And through him, I found out a guy I went to film school with named Larry Freed was there, so just catching up with them was really cool and such a great surprise. Then Zach, Amanda, and Kaylin introduced me to this guy named Murjani, who I chilled with the whole time, so shout out Murjani, you're super cool. And through all of them, I was consistently just meeting somebody new, like every 2 hours, it felt like. And if I keep going on and on, there's gonna be too many people to list, but if I met you, thank you so much. Special shout out though to Michael, who I sat next to on the plane. This is a guy who instantly, as soon as I saw him, I was like, damn, this is a guy going to the Toronto International Film Festival. We all have a certain look to us, but he pretty much broke down this whole story of how he got in contact with Sean Baker by sending him a signed porno DVD box set, and Sean Baker followed him on Instagram. I'm seeing this guy DM Sean Baker right in front of me, which just made me appreciate Sean Baker more, who I saw at a coffee shop while I was in Toronto. He was already talking to 2 other people, and I didn't want to be the guy that says, oh, by the way, I live 5 minutes from the Florida Project now. I love your movies. When it comes to people like that, I'm not going to interrupt their day if they're busy. But the fact that I was just in an environment where I'm going to a little coffee shop and Sean Baker, who is a pretty legendary filmmaker these days, is right there, pretty fucking cool moment in my book. So yeah, I know it's an expensive festival. I get it. But if you are a movie fan, if you are somebody that is watching a video like this that's about to be as long as this one, trust me, I know it's expensive, but find any possible way you can to go. If you're under 25 years old, there's plenty of passes you could get that save you a ton of money on the ticket end. I talked to a lot of people that were able to rush a lot of movies, which means you're not guaranteed a seat, but if you wait a little bit before a movie starts, you're almost guaranteed to get into a lot of the stuff. And I went the sketchy Airbnb route. I didn't go with any roommates, but I went to like a little apartment thing that I probably won't do again if I have a little bit more money to spend. But find roommates. You know, what we did for Sundance before was a bunch of us get together, get a big cabin that is expensive, but when you break it down and you're all splitting the cost, you save a lot of money. And with Toronto being in such a huge city, like, just find a group of people, even if they're online strangers. You might die, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. It's something you have to go to at least once if you're a film fan. And who knows, if you want to save a bit of money, start your own YouTube channel, start your own website, just do some work and you'll never know where it takes you, because never a day in my life did I think this would possibly happen. I have a couple of friends that have done press over the years, and I always was like, man, that would be so awesome to do. And the fact that so many of you have supported this channel and I got my first shot at doing that for a festival means the absolute world to me. But if you're somebody in this space and you want to start creating stuff, just start. You know, the videos will be shitty in the beginning. My videos are still kind of shitty now, and I'm so thankful I was. I hope to go back next year and many more years to come. But yeah, I hope to see you there one day, and if you see me one day, come say hi. But enough about the TIFF experience. We're going to talk about everything I saw at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2024, because like I said, I saw 37 movies. That's a lot of movies. So this is a great video / podcast episode, because I guess I'm going to put this on Spotify. It'll be linked down below when I figure that out, because I plan on doing a once a week podcast very soon, just breaking down the movie news of the week and giving my honest thoughts on everything going on in this industry. So this is kind of like episode 0 of the pod. So I hope you enjoy it. This is going to be the most improvised podcast episode of all time. And also, I will say, after you watch this video, go check out the live stream I did with Zach and Amanda, where we kind of broke down our top 10 of TIFF, because I am going to go through every movie I've seen here and go a bit more detailed in my picks. But like I said, there's a lot of movies and I didn't get to see all of them. And Zach and Amanda got to catch a few films that I didn't get the chance to see. So there is a lot there. and they are awesome. So be sure to support the podcast. Zach and Art do a great job with it. Art wasn't there, but shout out Art as always. So for whatever reason this video just isn't enough for you, you have a whole ass other 2.5 hours that you could spend with me again. But I'm excited to dive deep because I want to talk about every single one of these movies, and we're going to do it in the order that I saw them. So like I mentioned, we're going to be covering a lot of the biggest movies of the year, but I don't want to spoil my ranking just yet. There'll be a ranking at the very end of the video. So if you're on the couch, grab a beer, grab popcorn, whatever you're into. If you're on a run, I hope I keep you motivated and don't get you to stop. If you're at a shitty office job that you can't stand, I hope I get you through the day. If you're at a job that you hate, I hope this makes the day a little less shitty. So let's just get into it. These are the 37 movies I saw at the Toronto International Film Festival. So the first movie I have ever seen at the Toronto International Film Festival is Steven Soderbergh's Presence. Now, Steven Soderbergh is one of those directors, a lot of people put him in their top 10 of all time. I just haven't seen enough of his stuff to justify that. I've seen a lot of the classics like Ocean's 11, Traffic, Magic Mike, I guess at this point. And I actually don't dislike anything I've seen from him. I actually like, I think, a majority of the stuff I have seen. But I feel like he's just put out so many movies over the past few years that just go under the radar so fast that it's kind of hard to keep up with his filmography. And there were a lot of options that first morning of what I could watch, but I decided to go with Presence because it sounded like a very interesting concept to me. If you don't know what this is, this pretty much follows the story of a family moving into a new house that has a presence in the house. So it's kind of like a haunted house ghost story kind of feel. It leans more towards a ghost story versus, say, a haunted house general horror movie. But the main gimmick here is that the camera itself is the ghost. So technically speaking, you are the ghost the entire movie, which I found very intriguing. Like, I wanted to know what kind of movie this was going to be. And like I said, I thought this would maybe lean more towards the horror side of things than the drama side of things, but this is definitely a drama first kind of movie, and I really appreciate that. And I think the movie ends up being a lot better because of that, and this kind of inspired me to check out a lot more of Soderbergh's earlier work, the ones where he shot on iPhones and just tried weird stuff, because I haven't heard necessarily terrible things about them, and maybe this will end up still being the best of those gimmicky kind of movies. But so far, this is my favorite movie of 2025 because this is coming out in January. And it's one of those movies where when I walked out, I was like, that was really solid. And then I grabbed breakfast with Zach, Amanda, Caitlin, and Marjani, and we're all talking about the movie because a few of them had seen it at Sundance earlier in the year. And they asked, what did you think about this thing at the end? And I was like, oh yeah, that was a pretty cool thing to do. And they said, oh yeah, how it means this? And I just completely lost that, I guess. And I just had realized in that moment that one aspect of the ending I interpreted in a different kind of way. So then when you think back on the rest of the movie, there is a lot of little clever things that are definitely in there. And it's one of those movies you want to watch almost immediately as soon as it's done and kind of pick up on little things you probably didn't notice the first time. So on top of that aspect being super satisfying, there's also a really great family drama in here. It's a classic family of four. Certain family members get along better than other certain family members. And since you're the ghost, you kind of get to go with the camera and see which characters are reacting in certain rooms, in certain scenarios, which family members are trying to be quiet about talking their shit or hiding certain things in the family. I just found all of that super interesting. And sometimes with a movie like this, you kind of get afraid that the gimmick is going to be the only good part about the movie, or it's just not going to be fully utilized to its potential. But I think what they do with the gimmick is the best thing they could have possibly done. I could see an argument where if you made this a horror movie, it could have been a much different, more interesting kind of movie. But I also don't know if that movie would be better than what Steven Soderbergh did here with Presence. And I will say a majority of the cast here is really solid. And I'm not going to say who I think is solid and who's not, because without spoiling things, there is one character in this movie that I think was just so awful, like truly brings the movie down a whole ass notch with certain decisions that are done with the character. Like, I don't think the character shouldn't be in the movie, but I think the character goes on for far too long with certain things that they do, and you're like, okay, this is just so cringe at this point. And the movie kind of sets up three distinct paths that it could have taken, and I just think it took the worst of the three paths. But by the time the movie ends, it does something that's super satisfying, and you're like, man, like that was a damn good movie. And I love when a movie makes me feel that way. This has definitely been one of the ones that I have thought about the most since leaving TIFF, and I'm super excited to see this again. It made me super excited to go back and see a lot more of Soderbergh's more experimental stuff he's done over the past 5 to 10 years. And it's definitely one I would add to your Letterboxd watch list immediately. It's a very intriguing movie, a very interesting premise to go off of. And I think if this was in the hands of someone besides Soderbergh, it could have been an kind of experience. But I think it's super satisfying in what it goes for, and I definitely recommend it. It's, like I said, my favorite movie of 2025 so far. After Presence, I saw Seed of the Sacred Fig, which, if you don't know, is a German movie, which is probably going to end up being a huge international film, which I could almost guarantee is going to make the top 5 for Best International Feature at the Oscars this year, because it's from Iranian filmmaker Muhammad Rusalov. Might have butchered the name. I am sorry, Muhammad. But this is a guy that was arrested in Iran for making films, essentially. And while he was waiting for a certain sentence, he started filming this movie, and then he escaped the country and moved to Germany to finish making the film, because when you make something with the subject matter of this film, certain countries don't like that shit. And from the get-go, I have to say this makes me appreciate the film a little bit more. At the same time, I'm not somebody that's going to give a 5-star review based off the background of a story, but I do think it's worth noting that that is something to be aware of when you go into this. But I think that's important to keep in mind when you watch this movie, because I think the problem with a lot of movies that try to be important about a political message is that it feels too spoon-fed a lot of the times. Like, I'm somebody, you should use art to do whatever you want to do. But if it feels like the message is more important than the movie you're making, sometimes the movie just kind of falls on its face a little bit. And here it feels like the message is more important than the movie. And I feel like when the movie is trying to emphasize that, it's actually the best part of the movie. This is a country that has gone through a lot, and there have been a lot of protests, and they use a lot of that protest footage in this actual film, where I think if you don't know that going in like I did, there's going to be a lot of shocking footage of real people that are really dying, and it's a lot to take in. And I think that part of the film is super successful when it's trying to be important and when it's trying to inform somebody like me that kind of knows a little bit about what goes on. But to get it from the perspective of a family, from a man that's gone through this entire fucked up system, is some truly powerful stuff in a lot of cases. But I think part of the movie falls on its face a little bit. But to tell you what the movie is actually about, you pretty much have this family of 4. You have the father figure, you have the wife, and you have 2 daughters. And the movie is about a lot, because the father is involved in this entire system and is kind of in this position where he's forced to give certain people sentences that he may or may not agree with. Meanwhile, you have the wife at home just trying to keep the family together, and you have the 2 daughters who are kind of in that newer political mind. You have the mother at home who's just trying to take care of the family and keep shit together. And then you have the 2 sisters who, like a lot of people, when you're growing up, you want to fight the system that you've been growing up in, but it feels a bit more effective here than it does in a lot of other movies. And I feel like that's the only thing I want to say about the actual story, because I do think if you go beyond that, you get into some spoilery type territory. And for that reason, this is a hard movie for me to talk about now, because like I said, I'm not going to talk about spoilers. But the one thing I will say about this movie is that by the 3rd act, I was kind of not feeling it anymore. I think what it does in the first 75% of the film is super effective. And if it kept doing what it was doing, this would probably no doubt be in my top 10 of the entire year. But I think by the end, it gets a little exhausting. It makes some decisions that, from a filmmaking perspective, I do not agree with at all. And I hate to be that guy, but it did kind of ruin most of the experience for me. And that'll be a trend with a lot of these movies I saw at TIFF, I feel like, where they kind of do something in the beginning that I'm really on board with, and then something, whether it's a story thing, whether it's an acting thing, it varies from movie to movie, but I felt it a lot with Seed of the Sacred Fig. In many ways, this does feel like the most important film of the year. When it comes to the subject matter, I could see a lot of people not on film Twitter talking about this movie when it comes out around Oscar time. But on the flip side, when the movie is good, I would argue it's probably great. I think the performances here are all incredible. I think the main four characters all have a different moment to shine, but the guy that plays the father has some scenes that made my goosebumps just go off. I think when the film is going for that really good family/political drama, it is really effective. There are certain moments from this movie that I will remember for the rest of the year and probably the next couple years. I think when you have the context of the guerrilla filmmaking they were pulling off in a lot of these scenes, it's very impressive from that perspective. And when I walked out of the movie, even though I felt like there was something missing in that final 25% of the film, there were a lot of people that walked out saying that's one of the best movies of the entire year. The guy I was talking to in line before the movie, shout out Wyatt, you're a super cool guy. After the movie, he thought it was great. Like, a lot of people walking out of that theater thought it was great. So I would still keep this on your radar. It's not going to make my top 10 of 2024, but I think it's going to make the list for a lot of people. And maybe that final act of the film is going to work for a lot of people. And if it does, I could see why this is potentially a Best Picture nominee. For me, it probably wouldn't be, but I definitely think it should make the short list for International Feature Film this year at the Oscars, without question. It's definitely a very unique film. I haven't seen many like it. I just wish I loved it as much as the first 60%, because if I did, this would be one of the best films of the entire year. So the first two films I saw, they were press screenings, but for my third movie of the day and the festival, I technically got to go to the first public screening, which they call the opening night film. It was the first time I was at the Princess of Wales Theater, which was so cool. But if you have back problems and you have 4 movies at that theater in a day that are in the balcony section, your back is killing you by the end of it. But I was at TIFF, so I'm not going to complain about that. But I will complain about Nutcrackers, which is the new David Gordon Green film, who has one of the weirdest filmographies in film history. I mean, he's the guy that did Pineapple Express, but he's also the guy that did the most recent Halloween trilogy and the newest Exorcist film. And it felt like he definitely wanted to play it safe for his next movie. You know, I didn't see Exorcist Believer. I have not heard one good thing about it. I did see Halloween Ends, and I know a lot of people swear by it, that it's one of the best Halloween movies. I thought it was a fucking train wreck and one of the worst movies of the past 5 years. But there's been some stuff I like from David Gordon Green, and I wanted to give his newest film a shot, which stars Ben Stiller and these 4 young kids that are actually brothers in real life. And it pretty much follows him watching over the kids because his sister died and he wasn't really that close with his sister, and he's not really close with these kids. So then the family friend is like, well, you gotta watch them until we find a new foster person. And you know exactly where this movie's going within 5 minutes of it starting, which is not a bad thing. You know, like, to me, a movie like this, if it's funny, if it's charming, if it gets you feeling something, it's totally fine to have the most basic storyline and jokes of all time. And at first I felt like I was going to give it the pass, since it felt like a family-friendly kind of PG-rated movie. But then like 30 minutes in, Ben Stiller says fuck or something like that. I don't know if it was fuck or fucking, but it was just so out of left field, and I was like, oh, it's not a family movie, so I could say fuck Nutcrackers. It's not like the worst thing ever. It's totally passable. Like, I don't think anybody's gonna walk out of this movie saying it's the worst movie of the year. But I also talked to so many people that walked out of it, and the best thing I heard about it was, yeah, it was fine. I'm probably a step below fine. I'm at the step where I'm like, yeah, it's really just not good. Hulu just bought this for at least $10 million. I think that's a wild price to buy this movie at. But it's the movie that your aunt who's not into movies is probably going to play at Thanksgiving this year. And you'll watch it and you'll probably give it 2.5 stars on Letterboxd. It's nothing to write home about. This is one of the movies I'm not going to talk that much about because I don't think it's going to make a splash for anybody. But it's not as bad as Halloween Ends. So if that's what David Gordon Green was going for, if he was trying to just save his career and do just a very safe, basic comedy, he does the job good enough here. And then my final film of day one is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cloud. This is the guy that's most known for that film Cure, which I have to come clean with. I tried to watch it before I left. Like I said, life has been super busy. I did not get the chance to see it yet. I'm very excited to see Cure. But I said, you know what? I still want to see this movie. I've heard a lot of hype about it, and it is an interesting time. This film follows a kind of wannabe entrepreneur. He kind of just drop ships online online. He's constantly reselling things at a bigger price. He's a scalper in real life. And the film kind of starts with him trying to grow his new empire, I guess. But then as his business starts to grow, it introduces a ton of new problems. But this is not the drama where it's like, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm trying super hard to make money. No, this is a guy that wants to make money and crazy shit starts happening. I'm not necessarily going to say what starts happening because I guess that could be considered a spoiler, but this movie definitely goes in a much different direction than you think it would if you just read the premise. But don't expect a movie about an entrepreneur that's super sad because he can't make it because shit's going wrong. No, this is a wild fucking movie. It's not exactly like Parasite, but in the same way where Parasite starts off as one thing and then the second half is something completely else. Cloud is like that. And the reason I say that is because I feel like if you went into this thinking it's going to be a drama and you're into that kind of thing, you'll probably walk out being like, what the fuck is this movie? But I do think it's a very fun time with the premise that it goes for. My audience was having a blast with this by the end of it. I think it's definitely a fun movie you should totally see in a packed theater if you can. For me personally, like I said, this is kind of the trend with a lot of these movies. I like the first half more before it gets too wild. I like where the movie decides to go, but I don't like the execution as much in that final half. To me, the first is just so tight and I was super into where it was going and I found a lot of that stuff a bit more funny. And I definitely walked out of the film overall saying, you know what? That's a good movie. I'm very excited to see Cure. I'm excited to see some of Kurosawa's other stuff. And overall, it was a great way to end day one of the festival. Next up, we have I'm Still Here. This is from director Walter Salles. Don't know how to pronounce his last name, which is a damn shame because he's a damn good filmmaker. If you haven't seen the film Central Station yet, it's kind of hard to get a hold of. It was really hard for me to watch it, but I managed to find a way to watch it a few years ago, and it's a great movie. Highly recommend it. And because I was such a big fan of that film, I knew this was one movie I had to see. There were a lot of options of different press screenings to go to this morning, but it felt like this was the only chance I was going to have to be able to see this, so I made sure to prioritize it. I was there very early in the morning, and I'm very glad I did because if Central Station is a great movie, I think I'm Still Here is a very solid movie. The film takes place in the 70s in Rio, and it follows a family, kind of Seed of the Sacred Fig-ish. And like how I talked about that film, I don't want to say much about this movie. I know I'm going to say that quite a few times because I don't want to spoil anything for you guys. And it feels weird to say that about this film because it is based on a true story, and it's a very important story, but I do think if you say what the story is, you kind of say everything that happens in the movie. And I think part of the emotional core of the film is not necessarily knowing what's about to happen. And some people might want to look into the story before this. I understand if you want to. But for me, I didn't even realize this was based on a true story until literally the end credits. And I'm not going to act like I'm a history buff. I knew absolutely nothing about how Brazil operated politically in the 70s. But I think what a great filmmaker does in a scenario like that is within minutes of this movie starting, you pretty much have all the context that you need. And not in a full, like, here's 3 minutes of text explaining how this government is functioning, but giving one line of text and then within minutes and different scenes kind of painting the picture of, okay, this is the scenario we're in here. It takes a very intelligent filmmaker to do something like that, and I really appreciated how he approached that subject matter here. And honestly, from every filmmaking perspective, I think this film is pretty incredible in terms of how it's filmed, in terms of how it handles the family's arc. I just think it's very well done. There's a lot of really good performances in here, but the standout is by far Fernanda Torres. The Best Actress category is absolutely stacked this year at the Academy Awards, so I don't see her getting a nomination. But if I was picking the top 5, she's no question making it. She is incredible in this, and I don't want to talk about what she has to go through because, again, it goes kind of into what the movie's about, but with what she is asked to do, I think she absolutely sells it the entire time. If I had one nitpick about the film, which is not necessarily even a nitpick for me, but I could see it being for other people getting turned off by this movie, is that I think the first 30 minutes come off a little bit slow, come off a little bit like, where is this going? And after those 30 minutes, when things start happening, you get really locked in and invested in what's going on. But I could see a few people, if they were streaming this on Netflix or something, watching the first 20 minutes and being like, and then turn it off, which is a damn shame because the film is super important and you kind of need the context of those first 30 minutes. But other than that, I think I'm Still Here is just a really good movie. Again, in terms of the 5 films that are going to end up in that Best International Feature at the Academy Awards, I haven't seen all of the movies that are going to make that short list, but I'd be very surprised if this film doesn't end up on that top 5 because A, it's a super important film, but B, which is kind of more important, because not only is it a film about an important subject matter, but it's also just a really good movie. And like I mentioned with Sea of the Sacred Fig a little bit, a lot of the times those aren't necessarily one in the same. And to see a film that's this important, be this good, I think is A+ for cinema. The movie's probably a B+ in terms of my personal rankings. It's really good. I definitely think you should check it out. But like I said, Central Station, man, that is a great movie that I think a lot more people should see. Out of all the musicals that were coming to the Toronto International Film Festival, The End from director Joshua Oppenheimer was definitely one of the ones I was the most interested in, if not the one I was most interested in, just because this guy comes from a very interesting background. You know, he's made some very acclaimed documentaries with The Act of Killing, which I like. A lot of people say is one of the best documentaries ever made. I have to rewatch it for sure. I think I was a little too immature when I watched it for the first time, but definitely a guy that a lot of people in the industry really respect. He also made The Look of Silence, which a lot of people also say is great. So the dude has a lot of experience when it comes to making an incredible documentary work. So to see him jump to making something fictional that is a musical is a pretty crazy thing to think about. If you don't already know, this is a musical that follows a very rich family during the end of the world where they live in their underground bunker. So they're surviving as the rest of the world is doing something apocalyptic. And pretty early on in the movie, Moses Ingram's character kind of just shows up, and it's all about her trying to see how to fit in with this rich family. And it's a very by the books dynamic that we've seen quite a lot over the past 10 years in terms of like the eat the rich kind of stories. But that wild premise connected with the musical aspect, connected with the director's history, had me very curious to see how this would turn out. And when I first walked out of the movie, my initial impression was I thought that was okay. And I think a lot of that had to do with just the overall length of the movie, because it's almost 2.5 hours. And when you're at a film festival, it's not like you're looking forward to every single super long movie. And I was looking forward to this one. But by the end of it, it felt like I had been in there for at least 3 hours and I was just kind of exhausted with the entire thing. But it's been about a month now since I've seen the film, and I think it's grown on me a little bit. Not to the point where I would say this is such a good movie, you have to go see this as soon as you can. I would walk out saying it's solid, you should check it out at some point, because there's a lot of good qualities about the film. Like, I think the production design looks really good. It's kind of like a basic look to the movie, and I could see why somebody would say it looks a little too stale, but I still think what they were going for, they end up really delivering on in terms of the entire look of the film. And you have an absolutely stacked cast here as well. Like, Tilda Swinton is Tilda Swinton. She's pretty much always great. Michael Shannon, you know, is already great in the movie. George McKay, who I have not seen a lot of, is arguably the star of this entire thing. Like, he is the protagonist of the film, but I was very surprised that you could argue he is maybe the best performer in this specific story. And then Moses Ingram, I'm not too familiar with a lot of her work. I think she still has a little bit of a stale taste in my mouth from the Obi-Wan stuff, and I don't necessarily think that's even her fault. I just think the show was so disappointing when it came out, and she's just attached to that in my mind. But she's also really damn good here. I would say this is probably the best work I've seen from her so far. And yeah, the entire cast does really good. And even the music, I think, is serviceable. Like, while I was watching the movie a month ago, I remember thinking all these musical numbers are pretty solid. But at the same time, now that it's been quite a while since I've seen the movie, I couldn't name you a single track from the soundtrack, but I do remember while I was watching the film thinking, okay, these are actually pretty decent. Like, a guy coming from this kind of filmmaking background, you wouldn't expect to be the songs as solid as they are here. But it doesn't have a single track where I think anybody's going to be humming as soon as they walk out of the theater, if that makes sense. The choreography is also pretty solid. I think it's pretty good in a lot of the musical numbers here. But George McKay, man, he has one move. The first time he did it, I bust out laughing. I thought it was so fucking funny. And then the second time you could actually process it and appreciate it. I was a huge fan of George McKay in this movie, both in terms of acting and the thing that he does. But I just don't think the film goes any deeper than you expect it to. Like, when you hear a premise like this from a director of this caliber, you think, okay, it's a movie about rich people living at the end of the world and they were probably involved in some sort of way, but it just never goes deeper than that initial idea. And I just feel like a lot of these kinds of movies that have done the eat the rich thing or rich people are scumbags have just done it in a more unique way. Like, obviously something like Parasite is such a basic example, but it does this kind of thing infinitely better. And there's a couple scenes where I thought the end was gonna go to that extra step or that extra level. Like, there's a dinner table scene in here that's great, and I'm a sucker for a great dinner table scene. But at the end of the day, the movie felt really long. I don't really have a desire to give it another go at any point. I do think it's solid. I do think you should check it out at some point. I'm more interested to check out The Look of Silence and rewatch The Act of Killing. And I am still excited to see what Joshua Oppenheimer wants to do, if he wants to keep going towards the fictional narrative route or if he wants to go back to documentary work. But going into the festival, this was probably one of my top 10 most anticipated of the entire thing, and walking out, it definitely doesn't make my top 10 of the year list. The Last Showgirl was one of the most hyped films going into the Toronto International Film Festival, as it stars Pamela Anderson playing a much older showgirl that has to kind of figure out what she's going to do with her life once the show she's been working in for 30 years is actually canceled, and the whole movie is just about her trying to figure life out. The film is directed by Gia Coppola, who is Francis Ford Coppola's granddaughter, and this is the first film I have actually seen from her, so I don't really have too much to base this off of in terms of her filmography. And I'll just say right off the bat, walking out of this, it didn't really sell me on checking out a lot of her stuff immediately, because the movie is not that good. And that really sucks for me to say, because I do think The Last Showgirl has a small handful of incredible things about it. Growing up, I had quite a few family members that worked in casinos, so I'm pretty familiar with the types of personalities that come with doing that kind of work. And I will say right off the bat, Jamie Lee Curtis is absolutely incredible in this movie. And I have given her a good amount of shit over the past few years, ever since she won the Oscar for Everything Everywhere All at Once, one of the most undeserving wins maybe of all time in any award show. But she plays a waitress on a casino floor here, and she just kind of reminded me of my aunt, if I'm being honest. Like, I thought she nailed that type of character and that type of personality and all their little quirks so perfectly that I wouldn't have a problem with her winning an Oscar for this. I think she is so damn good in the movie, and that is such a disappointing thing to say because she's barely in the entire story. My Letterboxd review was literally, if this movie was about Jamie Lee Curtis instead of Pamela Anderson, I think it would have been one of my favorites of the entire decade, because I think the character is well written. I think Jamie Lee Curtis absolutely annihilates every single line of dialogue there. And filmmaking just requires a lot of things to go right. So when you have a team of collaborators that just know how to nail a certain thing and it's just magic, it's something to appreciate. And I really think they nailed this character well, and I have no idea why they didn't pivot to making the whole movie about this character, because instead we focus on Pamela Anderson, who a lot of critics are praising for her performance in here, and I think she was just fine. Like, the way some people were tweeting about her performance, you would think she gave the performance of the decade. Like, it was unbelievable what people were saying about her in this movie, and I don't want to say she's bad, because she's not bad. I think objectively speaking, she is fine to maybe solid in the role here, but the performance did not live up to that hype that a lot of people are building, at least for me. And I think a lot of that has to do with the writing of her character. She just seems so underwritten with not too much to do. But at the same time, Jamie Lee Curtis has way less screen time, and she just feels like she fully understood the character she was trying to portray, versus Pamela Anderson's kind of just playing Pamela Anderson. And going back to the writing, I mean, it's not just necessarily the writing of the character or the writing in terms of her dialogue. It's a lot to do with how this entire story just feels very undercooked. Like, there are times in this movie where it feels like we are getting literal minutes of Pamela Anderson walking around Vegas, whether it's in front of the lights of a casino or just in a barren wasteland of Vegas, or she's on top of a rooftop and you see the strip skyline in the background and there's music playing, or there's a voiceover of her saying how life is hard or whatever. It's just not that much here to talk about. And by the time the credits rolled around, all I could think about was why movies take so much more time to make than something like a piece of content for the internet. But with something like a film, if there's filmmakers that really care about the project and want to make something that's truly great, you make sure that your idea is as developed as it possibly can be. You need to let the idea cook in the oven just a little bit more. You know, you need to add a couple more story elements to your really good idea to make a great movie. And I just feel like if the film had gone through 4 or 5 more drafts in the screenwriting process and made the decision to put a bigger emphasis on the Jamie Lee Curtis character, we would be easily talking about one of the best picture contenders of the entire year. And even though I do feel pretty negative about the film overall, one more thing I want to talk about is Dave Bautista here, because he is somebody that continues to impress me, and he's proven that he could be that loud, intimidating type of character in a lot of roles already, but this is the first one where he feels much more quiet. And we've seen him kind of do that before, like Blade Runner 2049. He starts off kind of quiet like that, and then he ends up being a Dave Bautista type brute. But in here, the entire time, he just plays a completely different character than what we've seen from him. And I thought he was also really great here. I don't think the performance is necessarily Oscar worthy, but I do think we are one Dave Bautista performance away from him winning an Oscar sometime in the next 10 years, because the dude is super talented. And even though him and Jamie Lee Curtis are absolutely incredible in this film, I really do wish I could say the same about the rest of the movie. I got to see We Live in Time at the world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, and it was definitely one of my most anticipated of the entire trip. I think it's hard to find somebody that truly dislikes both Andrew Garfield and Florence Pugh. I mean, the two of them are some of the best talent we have in Hollywood, and they also get bonus points for seeming, at least, like they're some of the most genuine people in Hollywood, which is something that's pretty rare. So when you take two talented, really good people, put them together in a rom-com that's getting distributed by A24, you have my attention. Especially when you bring in director John Crowley, who previously did Brooklyn, which I really did enjoy back in 2015. And rom-coms are really not my thing, so you really need to bring your A game when I'm going to one of these, because if not, I'm gonna be zoning in and out the entire time. I just feel like a lot of them get too cheesy, or they're just not funny enough, but luckily, I think We Live in Time is pretty great in terms of being a rom-com. A lot of them just aren't funny enough, and they feel a little bit too repetitive. And although I wouldn't say We Live in Time is necessarily on the list of the best rom-coms ever made, I do think it's pretty damn good. And the real test for me is that if you send a couple to see a rom-com and the boyfriend is cracking up while the girlfriend cries at 2 completely different scenes, I think you have a winner in a movie. And I think We Live in Time absolutely nails that part of being a rom-com. Like, in terms of comedy, the movie is actually really funny. Like, there's one scene that involves parallel parking that really cracked me up. There's another sequence involving a bathroom that had my entire theater howling. And I understand I was at the world premiere, it was a super packed theater, but it's truly one of the best sequences I've seen in the entire year, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. And in terms of their performances, there's a lot of good and just a little bit of bad, I would say. Because in terms of the good news, I mean, it's no surprise that Andrew Garfield and Florence Pugh are really good in a movie together. Like, come on, there was never any doubt about that. But I will say, if Florence Pugh is really good in the movie, then Andrew Garfield is great in the movie. And I'm somebody that probably puts Florence Pugh in the top 5 best actresses working today. So good on both of them for absolutely killing it in the film. But at the same time, I can't help but feel like I actually buy their chemistry. Like, if the point of filmmaking is to tell a seamless story and you're supposed to buy into the illusion that you're seeing on screen, then I just have to be honest. At no point did I ever feel like these two were actually a couple. And I don't know how to describe it other than saying that each of them feels like they both play a great partner individually, but it just feels like two really talented actors that are pretending to be a family the entire time. And that's not a negative that I'm going to scream about. I'm not going to walk out of a movie being like, oh my god, actors just felt like actors. It's not something that kills a movie for me by any means, but I do think it stops We Live in Time. Like, We Live in Time is a good movie, no doubt, but it stops it from being a great movie. There's also some emotional beats that the film goes for throughout the entire story that just really didn't work for me. But I also think that's a personal thing of me not feeling that emotion, because my theater had a lot of sniffling at a lot of parts. And even if I don't cry in a movie, there's quite a few times where I'll feel like like tearing up, but I really don't. But again, I don't think a lot of people agree with me on that. I'm going to take my girlfriend, at the time of recording this anyway, I'm going to take my girlfriend to see this tomorrow, and I'm sure she's going to be a wreck by the end of it. But again, I don't think a lot of people are going to agree with me on that. Like, at the time of recording this, I'm going to take my girlfriend in the morning to see it for her first time, and I don't expect her to not cry. I think she's gonna be crying a lot in this movie. I think the themes the film plays around with are a lot more interesting and deeper than a lot of rom-coms in the genre, but overall, We Live in Time is just a solid date night movie. But at the same time, I don't think you're gonna be talking about it 3 years from now, and I'd love to be proven wrong, but as of now, that's how I feel. One of the most talked about movies of this entire award season is Pedro Almodovar's The Room Next Door, which is the Golden Lion winner, and the film stars Julianne Moore, who plays this author that reconnects with an old friend played by Tilda Swinton, who is terminally ill, and she is trying to convince Julianne Moore's character to go on a trip with her so she could peacefully kill herself. So yeah, it's a movie about euthanasia, and Almodovar is one of the most respected living filmmakers out there, and I am ashamed to say I am very behind on his filmography. Like, it's almost embarrassing to talk about. The only film from him that I caught before seeing this was All About My Mother, which I did like, but stuff like The Skin I Live In, Parallel Mothers, pretty much everything else that he's made, I still have to watch, and I'm really looking forward to still. And I was really looking forward to this, especially when you consider this was his first film in English, which is already a challenge in and of itself. But within about 15 minutes of this starting, I just knew this was not my kind of movie. And to be fair, melodrama rarely hits for me. Like, it's really, really hard for melodrama to hit for me. Like, the most recent example is May December. That was a lot of people's favorite film from 2023. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I respected it for what it was. I'm not going to play that every day. It's just not up my alley. I find some of it kind of cringe funny, but at the same time, I just don't think it's something I could throw on all the time. And even though The Room Next Door doesn't go for it like something like May December does, I still think the kind of comedy and the kind of dialogue in here is in that same kind of vein. And maybe it's because the last big melodrama I've seen also starred Julianne Moore. Maybe that's why I'm making the direct comparison here. But if May December is like a 10 out of 10 in terms of melodrama, I would say this is like a 7 out of 10. But again, that's on like the melodrama scale, and my scale is much more weighted down when it comes to this kind of movie. I mean, you could make the argument that these two are the best living actresses that we have, so just throwing them in a room could easily make a great movie. But the dialogue between them is just so damn stiff, and I get that's what they're going for. I understand why the interactions are being discussed this way, but it's the type of movie that a very specific cinephile is going to absolutely love, and the rest of the population is going to go like, what the hell are we watching here? It's a movie that on paper should feel like it's easy to connect to, but the way it's delivered, it's kind of hard to connect to a lot of it. And I don't mind admitting that I'm with the general public on something like this. Like, it's just not gonna be for me. I will say there is one bit they do towards the end of the movie that is absolutely hilarious, and if the rest of the film was as genius as that bit that they do, maybe I'd be sitting here and trying to say, you know what, melodrama is actually awesome, and The Room Next Door is the movie that made me realize that I actually do love melodrama and the rest of them just aren't as good. But this is just one I'd have a tough time recommending to almost anybody unless you're into this kind of thing. But I'm still very excited to see the rest of Almodovar's work, but at the same time, I am very excited to see the rest of Pedro's work, even though I have absolutely zero desire to ever watch this again. I got to see Mike Flanagan's The Life of Chuck at the Toronto International Film Festival, where it actually surprisingly won the People's Choice Award, which, if you don't know, is a pretty serious award when it comes to foreshadowing the Oscars later on in the year. A lot of films that usually win the People's Choice Award is at least a pretty big contender for Best Picture. Now, we won't know for about a year and a half if that's actually going to hold true for this movie, because Neon recently picked it up and announced that it's going to come out later on in the summer of 2025. And the movie has had its fair share of criticism, but I think a lot of it has come on after the movie actually won the award. But I do think that comes from a lot of critics kind of reviewing this film as a Best Picture contender instead of actually reviewing it as the movie that it presents itself as. I like the Oscars just as much as anybody else on YouTube that talks about movies. I don't necessarily follow the predictions that much in terms of me coming up with my own predictions and trying to see what will and won't get nominated, but when it comes to that kind of YouTuber. I'm just not the person you come to that kind of advice. I let people with a lot more experience handle that. I'm just someone that likes talking about movies. But the day before they announced what the winner was for the People's Choice Award, I was actually texting my sister back and forth, and we were trying to discuss what would win. And when she asked me what I thought was going to be the winner, I said The Life of Chuck, because from the outside looking in, it didn't seem like The Life of Chuck was the kind of movie that would win the People's Choice Award, because it has been so tied to trying to figure out what is a Best Picture contender or what's going to be an Oscar player later on in the year. But at the end of the day, it's called the People's Choice Award. It's because people that are at the festival get to vote for what their favorite movie is. And whenever I would talk to somebody on the ground at TIFF and I would ask, what are some of your favorite movies that you're seeing? One of the films that was consistently loved by everybody was The Life of Chuck. If you didn't love the movie, you at least liked it. And if you liked it because it made you feel pretty good. Like, I think films like Anora and The Brutalist had a lot more acclaim coming out of the festival, especially from the critic sphere of people, but they also didn't have that many screenings at the film festival. Like, I think Anora and The Brutalist both had two. I think Anora eventually added a third public screening. So those were super hard movies to get to see. And if you didn't go to the movie, you didn't get to vote for it as a People's Choice winner. And I do think if there were more screenings of Anora, we would maybe be having a different conversation right now. But in the reality that we live in, The Life of Chuck is the People's Choice winner of the 2024 Toronto International Film Festival. And I don't think that should take away from the fact that pretty much everybody that saw this movie actually enjoyed it. And look, I'm a Mike Flanagan fan. I think I'm more of a fan in terms of his television work rather than his movies, because Hill House still has one of the best jump scares I have ever seen, maybe the best jump scare of all time. Midnight Mass is super underrated. It's still my favorite thing he's ever worked on. If you haven't seen that show yet, it is a must watch. On the actual film side of things, I've never been his biggest fan. Like, Dr. Sleep really didn't work for me. I hear a lot of people swear it's incredible, so maybe in a few years I'll give it a rewatch. But in terms of The Life of Chuck, it really is one of those films that is a reminder of when we talk about movies online, because when you break down filmmaking, especially in the critic sphere of things, I feel like a lot of the times you could only break it down into two vague departments. You have the craft, which is pretty much how well made a movie is on every sort of technical level, whether it comes to cinematography and the visuals or the lighting or the audio, whatever it is. It's the technical aspects that make a film incredible. And then you have the storytelling, which is not only just knowing how to tell a story, but also, did that story make you feel something by the time the credits rolled? Both of these things are important. I think a lot of the objective best movies ever made are really good at nailing down both of these things. There is one very big Oscar player this year that we're going to talk about later on in this TIFF recap video that has had a lot of hype this film festival season. And spoiler alert, I think it absolutely nails the craft better than any movie I've seen this year, but I think the storytelling had a little bit to be desired. And a lot of people that are specifically praising that movie are kind of dunking on The Life of Chuck, but at the same time, when you talk to a lot of those people in real life, a lot of them are the ones that really need to touch grass and see what the general public thinks about the state of filmmaking right now. Because I kind of agree with a lot of people judging this film harshly, because even when I was watching it, I kept thinking this isn't super impressive on a technical level. Even though Flanagan and Netflix had a pretty bad breakup, this still kind of feels like it was made for Netflix. But general audiences don't necessarily care about that type of thing as much as we do. And I think the reason The Life of Chuck won the People's Choice Award is because when you watch this movie, it's a hard movie to not like. It has the type of heart that is going to move anybody that's above the age of like 14. If you are 14 to 100 years old, The Life of Chuck will probably make you feel something. And I haven't really seen Mike Flanagan pull that off before. Like, I think one of the things that made his horror shows so unique is it did have some emotional elements there. But if you take some of those elements, what he does with The Life of Chuck is pretty much turns those into some sort of existential but still feel good kind of experience. And it does not deliver its message with any sort of subtlety, but I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because I'm so tired of every critic thinking that every movie needs so much subtlety that you have to find the message, because a lot of the movies that are considered the best of all time have zero subtlety to them at all. You look at a family movie like Back to the Future or Toy Story or The Lion King, you know what the message is, but we're not talking about how obvious the message is in any of those movies. They're just considered classics for a reason. It doesn't matter how obvious the themes are of the film. What matters is it made people feel something, they're memorable, and they stick around for a while. And I'm not saying The Life of Chuck is any anywhere near any of the three movies I just mentioned. Because when I watched the movie myself, I did have a roller coaster of opinions throughout it. The movie is split up into three distinct acts. The first takes up a decent amount of time, the second one takes up less time than the first act, and the third is by far the longest. I don't know exactly how long it is, but if I had to guess, it's probably longer than the first two combined. And my biggest problem with any sort of anthology kind of movie is that 9 times out of 10, the same complaint I always have is that one of those acts was so good that I wish just that was the rest of the movie. And The Life of Chuck definitely falls in that kind of category for me, because I think the first act of this film is actually incredible. There's just so much going on so early in the movie, and there's so many things you try to piece together, and that is definitely when Flanagan's horror background comes into play the most, I would say. But as the film progresses into the second and third act, it quickly becomes obvious what the movie is actually about. And although I do really love the overall message of the movie, and I think it is pretty warm by the end of it, I feel like the way we get to those certain points is just kind of clunky. And maybe I shouldn't say clunky, because even that I don't think is the right word. It just feels like one of those anthologies where multiple directors were behind it, and that Flanagan in the first act was the star of the show, and then the other two directors didn't nail it as much. Like, the third act here is going to be loved by a lot of people, and it's in a genre that I would consider one of my favorites, but I've just seen so many better versions of that kind of story in recent memory that it just doesn't fully work for me. But now that it's won the People's Choice Award, a lot of people are trying to figure out what Oscars it could possibly contend for, and there's been a lot of hype about Mark Hamill, apparently, which is so wild to me. I mean, when you're watching the movie, no, there's 0 point where you're like, wow, this guy deserves an Oscar for this. If anything, it kind of feels like the equivalent of giving an Oscar to Jamie Lee Curtis for Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like, it's possible, because we live in a world where the Oscars are all about campaigning for the person that hasn't won an Oscar yet, and let's give it to them before they die instead of actually awarding the best performance of the year. But again, we'll actually see what happens when the Oscars roll around. In terms of negatives I have, it's hard to really dunk on The Life of Chuck for me. Like, I agree with a lot of critics out there. To me, this doesn't scream like the best movie of the year or one of the best films that deserves to be recognized at the Oscars necessarily, but not every movie needs to be that. I don't need every movie I see to be one of the best picture nominees later on in the year. A good film shouldn't be defined by awards that are made up by a group of people that vote on what the best movie is. A movie's merit in history should not come down to, is it worthy of an Academy Award? To me, that's just dumb, because it's just a bunch of old people voting anyway. But I think this is the type of movie that you could put it on for pretty much anybody in your life, and they're gonna feel good watching it. And to me, if that earns Mike Flanagan a Best Adapted Screenplay, because there are things in the third act that tie in a unique way to the first act that I really found interesting. So if he got nominated for that, and this was like the 10th Best Picture nominee for 2025, 2026, then hey, I just can't be too upset. I got to attend the world premiere of The Fire Inside, which is a new boxing biopic coming out this Christmas from Amazon and MGM, and it tells the story of a young Clarissa Shields growing up in Flint, Michigan, and it pretty much documents her journey from becoming an amateur boxer all the way to her trying out for the Olympics. And on paper, yeah, it sounds like a movie you've seen before, and that's exactly how I thought this entire story was going to play out. But the film is directed by Rachel Morrison, who, if you don't know, is the first woman to ever be nominated for Best Cinematographer at the Academy Awards. She was nominated for her work on Mudbound, and she's worked a lot with Ryan Coogler in the past on films like Fruitvale Station and Black Panther. And cinematographers don't really have a great track record of transitioning from shooting a movie to actually directing one of their own. Like, one of the biggest films at TIFF that we thought was going to be good was Pedro Palermo, which I ended up not seeing because everyone I heard saw it really didn't like it. You could go through the history books of a lot of failed movies that came from cinematographers, so they just don't have the best track record in transitioning into that role, which makes it even more impressive to say that this film feels like Rachel's third or fourth picture, because to say that she crushed this is an absolute understatement. This feels like a very, very impressive directional debut. One of the best we've gotten in the past 10 years. Obviously, when you have an Academy Award nomination for shooting a movie, you would expect the one that you're directing to look pretty good, But this movie looks beautiful, even though it's not necessarily shooting the most beautiful place in the world in terms of visuals, but they make Flint look beautiful in its own way, and it really does a great job of showcasing that culture, even in the cold winter area. But they really do a great job of showing the beauty of Flint, and we'll get to that in terms of the culture that they portray later on, but I think they really take advantage of their environment and make something beautiful out of it. And even though she didn't work with Ryan Coogler on Creed, I could only imagine he gave her some pointers about working on a boxing sequence, and the ones we get here are really damn good. And the way they set up this movie, I don't know how to explain it other than it didn't need great boxing sequences at all. Because what Barry Jenkins does with the script and Rachel Morrison does with the directing, they do an excellent job early on in the film and throughout the entire timeline in setting the stakes of what this girl has to lose. So by the time the final boxing match happens, I swear to God, the guy next to me was doing this. Like, he was dodging punches with Clarissa because you feel the stakes here. Like, you are rooting for this girl from start to finish. And I think a lot of that has to do with the portrayal that newcomer Ryan Destiny does for Clarissa Shields. Very similar to how it feels like this is Rachel's second, third, or fourth movie. This feels like the fourth or fifth time that Ryan is leading a movie, even though this is seemingly her first big role. And you just feel like you're watching Clarissa Shields. And I say this all the time. It's not just with biopics. It's with so many movies where a lot of times it just feels like you're watching actors and be really good as actors, but they still feel like they're being actors. But with Ryan Destiny, you just feel like you're watching a real person the entire time. I thought she absolutely killed it. And after this, she is definitely a name to keep your eye on over the next decade because I think she's absolutely incredible. Now, Brian Tyree Henry plays her trainer, Jason Crutchfield, and he is always good. I don't think it's any shocker to say that Brian Tyree Henry is good in this movie. He's just one of those performers, every time you see him on screen, you feel like he's not trying. Like, you know he is, but he just comes off so naturally gifted that he's just good in everything. It's almost unfair because he just shows up and gives one of the best performances of the year almost every time he's on screen. And I could see somebody saying he feels like he's just playing Brian Tyree Henry again, but at the same time, I would say this character has fit his best qualities of an actor better than any character I've seen him play in recent memory. He just naturally fits into the role, and the chemistry between him and Ryan Destiny feels so real. It feels like a real boxer and her trainer. And even though it doesn't seem like Amazon is going to do a big push in terms of an Oscar campaign for this movie, if there's a world where either of them somehow get in that fifth slot in terms of nominations, I would not be upset at all. I'd be very happy because they are both really damn good here. And I also think Rachel Morrison, like I said, I already mentioned that she does a great job directing, but I think she does a great job at painting the culture in a perfect way. And maybe that has to do with something like Barry Jenkins being your writer, because he actually wrote this before Moonlight and talked about how he was really hungry to get work, but you could still tell the dude has always been talented. But I just feel like it would be so easy to get another writer and director combo to tell this exact story. But if they got any other two people to do it, it would not feel nearly as authentic as the team that they got. Because when you watch this movie, you feel like you're watching Clarissa Shields and everybody that grew up with her. And I don't know how to describe it other than, I know I just said Brian and Ryan are incredible in the movie, but there are a handful of actors that aren't in the film as much, that don't get too much screen time, and they're still just as good as those two. You'll have a guy that says literally maybe 2 lines in the movie, but he feels like a real person in Flint. And I love when a movie does that, because so many movies have that movie quality to them, where you feel like you're watching actors, and this is not one of those by any means. And without spoiling too much of the film, I think if you go into this thinking you know where the film goes, I would understand where you're coming from. But what makes The Fire Inside that much better is it doesn't end where most of these boxing movies tend to end. In fact, that's just where the third act kind of begins. And I love when a sports movie does something like this. That's one of the things that made Foxcatcher so interesting for me. And even though this isn't exactly like Foxcatcher, there are some elements that I would compare that to. And whenever a sports film does that, it just elevates it above everything else in its class in recent memory. And I went in hoping I would like this, because when a sports movie is good, I'm a pretty big sucker for it. I just find them so interesting and just so rewatchable. and a lot of them do make you feel good. At the end of the day, they do end up being pretty hit or miss, and I would say The Fire Inside is an easy hit for me. If Amazon knows how to market this and get it into theaters, I could easily see around Christmas time being a good word-of-mouth movie. Like, I think a lot of people want to see this. It's one that is really hard to dislike, but I could totally see it going way too under the radar. So that's why I'm really trying to get the word out early on this movie. The Fire Inside, to me, is a must-watch. It's not only one of my favorites of the film festival, but right now it's in my top 10 of the entire year of 2024. I think it's really great. And to be honest, this was the only film of the 37 that I saw at the film festival that made me cry. And if that doesn't count for something, I don't know what does. Another film I got to catch the world premiere of at the Toronto Film Festival was Eden, which is directed by Ron Howard. And the cast is absolutely stacked here. We're talking about Jude Law, Vanessa Kirby, Daniel Bruhl, Sydney Sweeney, and Ana de Armas. And this is based off a true crazy story where this German philosopher and his wife, played by Jude Law and Vanessa Kirby, pretty much abandoned civilization and tried to make their own on this one island. And all of these local newspapers started writing about their story, so that inspired another family, which is led by Daniel Bruhl and Sydney Sweeney, to go to the island and try to find them, which then inspires Ana de Armas, who plays like this baroness character with her own little troupe, to come to the island as well. And each of them is kind of trying to start their own civilization, and there's obviously a lot of tension between the three different factions because they each want something different out of living here. So the film is kind of like a castaway survivor kind of story because they do have to survive the crazy wilderness of the island, but there's also all this kind of political drama in there as well. Ron Howard is a pretty hit or miss director for a lot of people. I have not finished Apollo 13. It is a crime against my family because my sister, dad, and mom all love that movie. So I can't make a fair judgment on his entire filmography, but I will say I think Ron Howard has a couple hits that I've really liked when he makes something like A Beautiful Mind or Rush, or his best movie so far, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. So I went into this cautiously optimistic. Like, I really did hope this was going to be a pretty big surprise at the film festival. And for me, I would say Eden is a pretty mixed bag overall. But at the same time, if I'm looking at it from an objective lens, I do think this is a movie a lot of people are going to enjoy because the things that this movie is based off, the things that happened in real life, are absolutely fucking insane. I stayed around for a Q&A after with the cast and Ron Howard, and he was talking about how this film has been trying to be made by a lot of different directors over the past 30, 40 years at this point. And the story itself is so crazy that it's so obvious that this movie should have been made a long time ago because it's insane. And when you have that story mixed with a cast that is this stacked, I mean, you're setting yourself up for a pretty easy win, I think. And everyone in that cast, I would say, is pretty good. Like, Jude Law is really good here. Daniel Bruhl is pretty solid. Every time I'm not sure if Sydney Sweeney is a good actress, she has to scream about something. I go, okay, this is your thing. And nobody does the screaming woman thing better than Sydney Sweeney right now. So I got to give her credit. She's really good here. Vanessa Kirby is good, but I would say out of the main cast, she probably has the least amount to do with the script, but she's still good whenever she shows up. Ana de Armas, a lot of people are saying steals the show. I wouldn't fully agree with that. I think she's fine. She has an accent in here. A lot of it doesn't really come across as great for me. It comes off more cringe, but she's clearly having fun with the role. And I could tell a lot of people in the movie were having fun with her role as well. But to me, I felt like she was the weakest of the five, kind of by a mile. But there was never a point where I thought, God, she is just so bad in there. Like, that thought never really crossed my mind. I think she's fine to decent to solid-ish in the movie, but everyone else kind of impressed me a little bit more than her. But my biggest problem with Eden, which is kind of maybe a combination of screenwriting and or editing, but this film just always feels like it hits a climax, or at least in one or two scenes I could think of, feels like the climax has happened, and then you're just kind of left there lingering for a little bit, and like more things happen, but it just doesn't ever feel like it's building up properly to certain things. And at the world premiere, in my screening, there was literally a point where a woman in the audience about 5 or 6 rows behind me had a very serious medical emergency, it seemed like, to the point where they stopped the movie, had like a doctor kind of come in out of the audience, and I saw them drag her body past me into the hallway, and I hope she's okay. But for me, I got an intermission that wasn't meant to be in Eden, and it was pretty much at the halfway point of the movie. I was more into the first half. I felt like it was seeming like it was building up to something that was going to be crazy, and crazy things do happen in the second half. But like I said, the timing of it, in terms of the sequencing, I think it's more of a screenwriting issue. Like, it should have been placed more properly in certain parts of the story, because this isn't necessarily based on a true story. It's just based off of the documents of certain people that survived this entire thing. So I don't know. I just feel like there's a better movie than the version that we got. And I don't know if that means adding a bit more perspective from somebody else. Apparently there's a lot of crazy excerpts of certain documents that weren't put in this movie, and I'm kind of thinking, why didn't we put that in the movie? Or if the climax had just been hit at a certain sequence of the story, maybe I'd walk out of here saying, hey guys, this is an obvious win. But by the end of it, I was pretty tired. Like, not in terms of being tired from the film festival, it's just when certain movies drag on for too long, whether I'm at a film festival or not, you just feel it, and this movie definitely made me feel that. I thought it was just okay. It seems like a lot of people that saw it at TIFF thought it was really good, and I wonder if part of that was because I talked to so many people going into Eden saying, oh yeah, the Ron Howard movie, that's probably going to be bad. So when it's not that bad, people walk out like, oh, that was pretty good. You know what I mean? Like, the expectations, I feel like, set you up to be like, oh, Eden's a really good movie, even though I think it's just okay. When it does come out, I do think it's actually worth watching. Whether you enjoy it or not is kind of up to you. I wouldn't say this is a bad movie. Like, I heard somebody halfway through at the intermission be like, oh, this movie's so bad. It's not. That person's full of shit. I just think it's very aggressively okay, and I wish it wasn't. I do think there's a lot of things to enjoy in it. I think the story is so crazy that you're gonna be like, holy shit. You're gonna be talking about it after. You're like, I can't believe this is actually a real thing. But for me personally, this is just not something I have any desire to rewatch at any point in time. I got to see the new Amy Adams film, Nightb, which I have to bleep, sorry Reed, because I'll get demonetized if I say that in the first 30 seconds of the video. But I got to see this movie at the world premiere in Toronto. Amy Adams and the whole cast and the director were there, which is pretty cool. And this was easily one of my most anticipated of the entire festival for a couple of different reasons. I didn't know much about it. I knew it was kind of about Amy Adams playing a mom that is slowly turning into a dog, and I talked about it a little bit with my girlfriend who has read the book, but that was kind of it. I like weird ideas, I like dark comedies, I like Amy Adams. The director, Marielle Heller, made 2 films, The Secret Diary of a Teenage Girl. Did I get that title right? Sorry, it's The Diary of a Teenage Girl, my fault. And Can You Ever Forgive Me, which are 2 films that I've heard are pretty good, but I have not seen. I have heard good things, and I have seen A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which was the biopic about Mr. Rogers where Tom Hanks played him, and I thought that was pretty damn good back in 2019. So I was really looking forward to this. I think the director seems pretty talented. And when you get all of those things combined, you expect a pretty good movie. And that is kind of what I got. And look, I am not a mother. I'm not even a parent at this point in my life. And I think decent movies are pretty good at relating to the specific demographic that it's trying to portray in the movie. But I think what makes a good movie is something where even if you can't directly relate to an experience, it does such a great job at painting that experience that you feel like you are in the character's shoes the entire time. And I think above anything else, Nightb is really good at making you feel like you are a frustrated mom the entire time. And you have to give a lot of credit for that to Amy Adams, who is really damn good in this movie. She's one of those actresses that is pretty consistently solid, and I think she's actually one of the few actresses that is really good at drama and comedy. And I don't think there's a lot of actors on the planet that would be able to nail the role quite as good as her. Now, I don't think she's the runaway Oscar winner that a lot of people thought she would be maybe a few months ago here. I saw a lot of other performances at TIFF that I do think are better than this one, which I'll get to later on in this TIFF recap video. But I do think she's definitely deserving of an Oscar nomination. Like, if there's the top 5, right, and the number 1's the winner, the second is runner-up, I think Amy Adams deserves the 3 or 4 spot on that list. Maybe they'll give it to her as a legacy type of Oscar for never winning for Arrival or something like that. I don't know. But I do think she is deserving of a nomination. That's for damn sure. And I also thought her partner, played by Scoot McNairy, was really funny here. So they're both individually funny, even though Amy Adams is the standout. But their chemistry, which it's not the average chemistry for a type of romantic movie. Like, Amy Adams is clearly the standout here, but I think the chemistry between them, it's not the same type of romantic chemistry with a lot of these types of movies, but the comedy they are able to bounce off of each other is really good. And I think the comedy in general is not going to work for everybody. I think a lot of people aren't going to find this to be that funny. Like, without calling certain people out, I could see a lot of people being like, oh, Nightb is not that funny. This is not a funny movie, guys, okay? But at least in my theater, everyone was laughing pretty consistently. And I'm the type of person where I've sat through a lot of movies where people are hollering and I think, okay, that was not that funny. Nightb is not one of those movies, though. I think it's cleverly written in a lot of scenarios. I think a lot of punchlines for certain jokes and deliveries of jokes are really good. I think a lot of the best jokes are delivered in the voiceover from Amy Adams, and I did see this pretty late at night a couple days into the film festival, and if you've never been to a film festival, you tend to get pretty tired. Like, I try and get as much sleep as humanly possible, but there's certain late night screenings where you feel like you miss a couple things. So even though I was laughing a good amount, I do feel like there's probably a few little jokes that I kind of missed on that I can't wait to see on a rewatch. But the dialogue feels really well thought out here. And I know there was a lot of hate about the trailer when it dropped just before this festival started. I'm somebody that doesn't watch trailers. I just heard people saying the Nightb trailer is terrible. But I go in as blind as possible to every movie. Like, I'm somebody, I try and see everything. So to me, it's like, why would I watch a trailer? I'm gonna see the movie. I don't want to know anything about a movie. I just want to hear the early buzz on a movie, if it's good, who the director is, who the actors are. That's all I need to know. I don't need to know much going into a movie. So I didn't watch the trailer, and I thought the movie was funny. And some people judge a movie before it comes out, but as someone that has sat through the entire thing, I think it's hard to argue that Nightb is a poorly written movie. Like, maybe you could say that in terms of structural things or the plot, or maybe it's too weird for you. I don't know. But in terms of like the delivery of the comedy and the build-up of certain comedic moments, I think the movie is pretty well written. And Nightb is one of those movies, which this happens quite a bit, where I don't really have any problems with it, but at the same time, I'm not walking out of it saying, that's one of the best movies of the year. Like, a lot of people, when they rate movies, they kind of go in and be like, oh yeah, there was nothing wrong with it, 10 out of 10. I'm not that type of person. I kind of start at like a 5 out of 10 scale, and we kind of go up points when a movie does something really good, and we go down points when it does something poorly. And to me, this is like a solid 6 out of 10 movie. 6 out of 10 to me is a good score. A lot of people think that's a bad score. It's a good score, okay? I think it's solid. I think it's funny. I think if you're a woman, you should get a girls' night out movie screening and just holler at a lot of the jokes together. You'll find it hilarious. I plan on seeing it a second time with my girlfriend when it hits theaters, so that way I could see what jokes I missed on. I could talk to her about how faithful of an adaptation it is. But at the moment, I would say Nightb is a solid movie. It's not making my top 10 of the year at any point, but maybe after a rewatch that will change, but I'm not convinced. I think it's a good movie. It's not top 10 of the year, though. Another film I got to see at the Toronto International Film Festival was The Assessment, which has a lead trio with Elizabeth Olsen, Alicia Vikander, Himesh Patel. It's a very Black Mirror-esque story where it follows this couple who's going through this interview process, because we live in a world, apparently, where you have to do this week-long experience to see if you are capable of having a child. Olsen and Patel play the couple, and then Vikander plays the person that comes in to interview them and see if they are capable, and she gives them the assessment. And this was a movie I was really excited about going into the festival because it had all of the marks of what could be a sleeper hit. Like, when you go to a film festival, a lot of times you're really looking for the movies that could be awesome, but there's usually like a new director behind it, or just the premise, it sounds interesting, or maybe there's one interesting actor in the film, but you're really hoping it's going to be as good as you want it to be. But within like 20 minutes of this movie, I was like, man, this is just not it for me. And it's frustrating because the idea is strong, the world it tries to build around the idea is strong. I even feel like the approach they take to the assessment itself feels somewhat original, but none of that ever matters if the execution just doesn't land with a lot of people. And it seems like a lot of people it did work for, but for me, I just found a lot of this to be really, really cringy. Like, I think Olsen is solid. I think Patel is okay. And Vikander is interesting to talk about because I don't know with what to say about her performance. And like I'm doing with this entire video, I don't want to go into spoilers, so I don't want to really ruin a lot of the surprises in terms of what she is capable of doing in this movie. And I don't want to call the performance necessarily bad, because I do think she's taking advantage of all the free range she has as an actor here. And it's so weird because I could totally see somebody walking out of this and being like, man, Alicia Vikander was awesome in that movie, because the role requires a lot from her, but there are just so many things where I was like, man, I can't believe we didn't pivot here at all. And whether that be taking a completely different approach or just picking a different actress maybe for the role, I don't really know. A lot of it just didn't really work for me, and like I said, I thought a lot of it was cringe, and maybe that's because it's the director's debut, and maybe she wasn't able to get the most out of Vikander's talent, because Alicia Vikander is somebody we haven't really seen in a while, and she is super talented. Like, I think she is capable of being one of the best actresses in Hollywood. And again, the movie just keeps on kind of going, and it just got to the point where I couldn't ever lock into what was happening, because every time I started to find something interesting here, there would just be a line of dialogue or something in that vein that would take me out almost immediately, and I'd have to reset and hope I could lock back into the movie. The story just feels so dragged out for so long, and then in the final 10 minutes, something starts to happen, and you're like, oh man, like, where is this movie gonna go? And then it just ends. And I just sat there and I was like, damn. So you could have made a much better movie this entire time. There is one aspect of the ending that I do love, and there is a dinner table scene. Like I mentioned with the end, I am a sucker for a great dinner table scene, and I will say that is probably the best part of this entire movie. I know I compared it to Black Mirror, but it really does feel like a stretched out episode of Black Mirror, and it's not even one of the best episodes in that series. It's kind of like lower mid-tier for me, but it seems like a lot of people that were at TIFF really did enjoy this movie. So when it comes out on Netflix, I mean, it doesn't have a distributor yet, but it feels very much like a Black Mirror episode, like something that should be on Netflix. If the premise intrigues you, I do think you should check it out to see if you click with Alicia Vikander's performance or not. I still don't know if I would necessarily say it's bad, but it is something interesting. I got to see the new A24 horror movie Heretic at the world premiere in Toronto about a month ago at this point, and there are very few films I get more excited for than something horror related that has the A24 logo at the front of it, because not only have they made some of my favorite horror movies of all time, honestly, over the past 10 years in terms of stuff like Hereditary, Midsummer, and The Witch. And even though not all of those horror movies work for me, something like Lamb did not work for me really at all. I can still appreciate a movie trying something new, even if it's not necessarily for me. But this feels completely unique to anything A24 has really made in terms of their horror filmmaking before, and I really want to compare it to two other horror movies that are pretty popular, but I feel like if I did that, it would kind of spoil the tone of what this movie is going for, and I really don't want to ruin that for anybody, because I think the best way to experience Heretic is to go in knowing pretty much nothing, if that's even possible, and just going with the flow. Like, yeah, I saw the trailer. The trailer doesn't reveal everything necessarily, but it would give me a little more than what I would want to know going in. And the whole way the entire story is structured, I'm telling you right now, if this video does you anything, it should be to just buy a ticket for Heretic and not know anything about it. And in this entire section of the video, I'm going to try my best to just not talk about anything very specific. I'm just going to talk about why this is one of my favorite movies of the entire year. But if you want the absolute basic premise, it follows two Mormon missionaries played by Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, and one of the people who reaches out to learn more about their church is Mr. Reed, who is played by Hugh Grant. So the two of them end up paying him a visit, and things start happening. And again, I think the less you know going into this movie, the better, so that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of the story. And I did say this was one of my favorites of the year, but just to emphasize how much I love this movie, I went in kind of excited, but this ended up being my favorite film of the TIFF Film Festival. And the reason I was so surprised with that was because the directors of this movie, who are Scott Beck and Brian Woods, previously made 65, the movie where Adam Driver plays the space marine who is fighting dinosaurs. And I, like most people, really did not like that movie at all. But these were also the guys that wrote the very first Quiet Place screenplay, so they're clearly somewhat talented in the horror genre. And after watching this, I would just have to assume that there is a shit ton of studio interference that we don't know about when it comes to 65, because I refuse to believe that the two guys that made that movie also made this movie. It might just be the biggest jump in quality from directors in like 10 years in terms of what was their previous movie and what was the follow-up. This is like the biggest jump I've seen in a very long time for anybody. You watch this and 65 back to back in one night, you would never guess in a million years it's the same directors. It's crazy. And the best part about Heretic is that even though I love a lot of the A24 horror movies, I do feel like a lot of them aren't super accessible. Like, I love Hereditary. Not something I'm going to recommend to everybody. Some people would consider I Saw the TV Glow a horror movie. Again, not something I'm going to recommend to my friend group if they want to have a fun night watching a horror movie. And even though it's an amazing movie, I just don't see it clicking with a lot of people. Heretic, though, is like the perfect A24 gateway horror movie in the sense that it does feel like it's dipping into elevated horror, which is such like an overrated, overused term at this point. Immaculate was one of my favorite horror movies of the year. It's not necessarily elevated horror. It's dumb, fun, awesome horror, and that's just as deserving of any other title. And some of the best horror movies ever made are literally about teens running away from a maniac trying to kill them. It doesn't have to be super deep all the time. But if somebody that goes to the movie theaters every once in a while for a fun type of horror movie, something like an Immaculate or a Smile 2 or a slasher movie, I think that same person will still have just as much fun in Heretic because it is consistently filled with tension the entire time, and that never goes away. But at the same time, this is a much more dialogue-focused movie. There is a lot more talking compared to pretty much any other horror movie in recent memory, and the topic of conversation is something that is popular. It is something that a lot of people have a lot of opinions on, and I think what Heretic does best is whatever your preconceived notions about that thing are going into this movie, it brings up a lot of points on many different sides that you probably haven't really thought about before. And it's one of those movies that you just want to talk to everybody you've seen it with. As soon as the credits roll, you're like, wow, okay, let's talk about this. And again, I love going to movies because of that reason. I feel like less and less these days I go into a movie coming out thinking about something. I want movies to intrigue me like that, where I walk out and I'm thinking of things I never really thought about before. But again, I don't need that in every single movie. What makes Heretic awesome is that it gives me that, but it's also just a great horror/thriller experience. And the movie got me thinking so much that the following day, I went to a second screening of Heretic. So I think officially, besides people that have worked on the movie, I'm probably the first person in the world to have gone to see Heretic twice. Because I went to the world premiere, I was super tired the next day. At film festivals, a few days in, you're really starting to feel it. And I was going to sleep in and I was going to recover a little bit. And then my friend Amanda said, hey, there's a good amount of seats, so you're not taking anybody's spot at this press screening if you do want to watch it again. So I went in, watched it again, and had a great time. I think this movie lives up to everything the first viewing was. And for movies like Heretic, I think that's important to know as soon as possible. You know, there's certain movies where you definitely have a great time, but the second time isn't as good when you know all the beats that the film is about to hit. And I think part of what made my first experience of Heretic so awesome was I just had no idea where the story could possibly go. Every 15 minutes, it just felt like, where the hell is this going? But Heretic is just as good, if not better, on a rewatch because the conversations are so well written and so entertaining between this entire trio, and it just feels like one of the most rewatchable horror movies I've seen in a very long time. Like, since I have left this film festival, the main movie I've just wanted to keep watching is Heretic. All three actors are fantastic, don't get me wrong, but there is a reason everybody is talking about Hugh Grant when coming out of this movie because he is so fucking good. There is absolutely zero shot he gets an Oscar nomination for this, but this is one of my favorite performances of the entire year. It might possibly be the best performance I've seen the entire year. I have to really sit here and think about it, but the more I sit on Heretic, I'm like, damn, Hugh Grant is an unreal talent. I want to see this guy cast in every movie ever made now. And this is a guy I was never really blown away with anything I've seen from him. Like, I didn't dislike Hugh Grant, but I've never seen something where I'm like, wow, Hugh Grant is incredible. I mean, the last thing I saw him play was in Oompa Loompa, and I wasn't necessarily blown away by that one. It is a movie that gives you a lot to talk about, but I'm not going to mention any of that in this video because I want you to be able to go experience this film for yourself. Part of the fun of Heretic is going in blind and discovering what the topic of conversation is for yourself and forming your own opinions about it. So if you don't know much about the film, I would try to avoid as many videos talking about this movie as possible until you get the chance to see it. It comes out very early in November, and I hope you get the chance to see it soon. This is my favorite horror movie of the year, but I don't want to hype you up in a specific kind of way. Like, Heretic is definitely not the scariest movie of the year. If you go into this thinking it's going to live up to like the Long Legs hype where it's like, hey, if you watch this movie, you're gonna fucking die. If you think it's gonna be that kind of scary, it's not in that vein. But if you just love a good ass fun movie with solid scary moments, great performances, and amazing dialogue, you're in for a treat. And it sucks that the Academy doesn't want to recognize horror movies right now, because not only is Hugh Grant absolutely amazing in this, but I think
Heretic is in real consideration for being the best screenplay of the year, and the movie's just so good. I want to watch it again right now. I can't wait to see it in theaters with my girlfriend and roommate who haven't seen it yet, and I just can't wait for all of you to get the chance to see it for yourself. I also got to check out a new thriller called Relay, starring Riz Ahmed. Pretty much helps people that are getting blackmailed by big corporations that they've been working for, but the twist is that he helps them through the Relay service, which, if you don't know, people that have speech or hearing disabilities use this service to communicate with people over the phone. And he does this so he could obviously keep his identity secret. And here's how you know a thriller is good, okay? Because by the fifth day, you're usually pretty tired. You're getting up early, you're going to bed super late, you're walking around all day, you're trying to meet new people, you're trying to catch up with people you've already met. And it's great. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love going to TIFF. This is not a complaint. I'm just saying by a certain day, you definitely start to feel tired. And there was a screening for this. I want to say it was around like 8:30 or 9 in the morning, and I was going to my apartment Airbnb at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was like, man, I just want to sleep so bad. But this was going to be my only opportunity to see Relay for the rest of the festival. So I said, you know what? I'm getting up. I am here. I'm going to be miserable for a couple minutes, and that's okay. So I put my big boy pants on. I got an extra large hot black coffee from Tim Hortons, and I just sat my ass in that seat. And at first I was like, okay, this feels like a very basic 90s thriller, to the point where even the font in the beginning of the movie, I was like, okay, I don't have to take this movie super seriously. Like, we can relax here. They know they're not really competing for Best Picture or anything like that. But it's directed by David Mackenzie, who previously did Hell or High Water, which is now, I feel like, every dad in America's favorite movie. And he also did that show Under the Banner of Heaven with Andrew Garfield, which I also actually really enjoyed. And for about the first 90-ish minutes of this, I was watching a little bit cynically, I would say. Like, I was enjoying it, don't get me wrong, but I did feel like, damn, I got up so early and I'm so tired for a 2.5-star movie. And a 2.5-star movie is never really that bad of a day. It's a decent movie, but when you're that tired, you're like, man, I could have used the sleep. But then the story does something that I did not think about being a possibility. And maybe on a day where I was very well rested, I'd be able to notice certain details and sort of think about something that could possibly happen. But I was admittedly caught off guard. And then I started to think about everything that happened previously in the movie. And I said, wait, no, that was well thought out. Okay. And then it really started to click for me. And I was like, okay, this is a solid movie. And I also really like the way they use the relay system. I know they kind of needed to use that because it feels like the thing that makes this somewhat different than any other thriller in this genre. Like, if they didn't have the relay idea for this, the movie would have never been made. It just would have been another basic thriller from the 90s. But it works. And not only does it pay tribute to the people that work in that field, but it also just helps set up the story in a very intriguing way in a lot of moments. Overall, I'm not going to be screaming, you need to see this movie. It's not really that good for me, but it is solid. And if your dad was flipping through cable back in the day and this popped on, within 2 minutes, he knows he's sitting on that couch and he's finishing the movie until the credits roll. So if you're ever looking for an easy to watch thriller, if you're sick and you're like, man, I just need something to pass the time and be entertained, this is the perfect movie for you. I was lucky enough to watch Conclave at the Toronto International Film Festival this year, and it was in my top 5 anticipated movies of that entire festival. And that was based entirely off the premise alone, because it follows the cardinals who are responsible for electing the new pope and all of the politics that are involved with that entire process. And it's directed by Edward Berger, who recently did the most recent All Quiet on the Western Front adaptation. And even though I was very interested in this movie based off the story and the talent involved, I was also pretty nervous because I feel like on paper, Conclave sounds like the type of Best Picture nominee or even winner, where the movie just feels very Oscar baity. It's not really loved by critics or audiences, but it talks about an important subject, and it just feels like an overall fine movie, but then it wins Best Picture, and then everyone starts shitting on it, and then for the rest of time, for 50 plus years, we start complaining about how a movie like Conclave won Best Picture. And when you hear that premise, it really is easy to just sit back and be like, man, I do not want to watch the movie where they vote for a pope. Like, I could totally see why somebody would think this is going to be something you would watch in class. And I understand that perspective. I was in a somewhat similar boat, hoping that would not be the case. But after watching this movie, it is very clear that to everybody that said that Edward Berger was going to disappear after All Quiet on the Western Front, he made it known with this that he is sticking around for quite a while. Because Conclave is not only a great movie, it is an exciting movie. I know a lot of people complain about All Quiet winning Best Score at the Academy Award because even though it was good, it was kind of just the same note played over and over and over again. And I do think Conclave is guilty of the same thing, but man, as soon as you hear the score, in the first 60 seconds, you are put in the spot of these people and you're like, wow, shit is about to go down. And I don't think you need to know a lot about Catholicism or how any of this voting stuff works, because I think the film does a great job of sort of setting up the different dynamics from the get-go. It does a great job at presenting the different factions of Cardinals, but it also does a really good job of painting the stakes of the situation. Because this isn't like an election where you could pick somebody every 4 to 8 years and there's different parties. This is, we're gonna vote on a guy and he's gonna be in that seat until he dies. And it makes it super exciting. And at the same time, I liked how the film didn't really present everybody as really black or white or everybody as super evil or super great. It just looks at each of these guys as people, and nobody is perfect, but there are a lot of people that are a lot worse than other people. And we start to discover this through Ralph Fiennes' character, who is leading this conclave through the voting process. And we slowly start to discover why some of these guys probably shouldn't be the Pope. Some want power, some are trying to hide some scandals, some don't want the power, but they don't love somebody from a different country being the Pope, so then they start to scheme as well. I'm not the first person to compare this to House of Cards or Game of Thrones, but it definitely does feel like it's in that same kind of vein in terms of political drama. So if you're into that kind of thing, this is the best version of that in terms of Pope voting, I guess. They address a lot of issues you would expect this to kind of touch on going into a movie like this, but they also bring up some things that I wouldn't have thought about previously. But I do think this movie does a great job at playing the field in a very fair way. It makes some choices that will definitely piss some people off, but I do think the film handles the story with care and respect overall, while also not being afraid to criticize when needed to. And I do think we live in a world where other filmmakers would probably want to play into one side of an audience instead of just feeling like it's an open conversation for everybody to come in and have a healthy debate about things. And I think Conclave succeeds at that. And also the performances are great. No matter how well known the actor is or isn't, it just feels like everybody is doing a great job all across the board. Ralph Fiennes is really good here, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. I still haven't seen a lead acting role yet though, where I've been like, man, this is the guy winning Best Actor at the Academy this year. But if he did win for this role, I wouldn't be mad at all. Just like how if Adrian Brody won for The Brutalist, I wouldn't be mad at that either. All I'm saying is I don't heavily prefer either of those performances to the other. I also don't have any real negatives about Conclave at all, but I was talking to my friend Zach from the Heretic podcast. We were at the same screening and had the same following screening, and on the way, we were both kind of in agreement that even though every individual scene of Conclave is great, it does feel like it's maybe missing one more incredible over-the-top wow scene. And I do think that is an important thing for a movie to have. It's like when you walk out of Sicario and you go, holy shit, the dinner table scene. Or you walk out of Sicario and go, oh my god, the scene at the border was insane. And I'm not saying Conclave needs hitmen or anything like that, but I do think the movies that end up being the best of the decade or the best of all time do have at least one or two wow scenes in them. And a lot of the movies that will probably not be as thought about 10 or 15 years from now that are still great are always usually lacking a scene like that. And to be fair, I don't think 90% of the movies made have a scene like that. It's a very hard thing to pull off. But when the rest of the movie is as good as it is, that's the only thing I could possibly think of. I just wanted that one thing, that one extra sort of piece of icing on top of the cake. That being said, this was not only one of my favorites of the entire film festival, but it was also one of my favorites of the entire year so far. And I am going to be very surprised if by the end of the year, it is not in my top 10. It is out in theaters right now, and I highly recommend you go check it out. I got to see Better Man, the new biopic about Robbie Williams, who I didn't even know was a person, honestly, before I even saw this movie. And I didn't even know that much about him. I didn't know anything about the movie in general because I got to go to one of the first public screenings at the Toronto Film Festival, and there was no trailer. There was not even a picture of the main gimmick of the movie. But this guy, Robbie Williams, is not being portrayed by a human in the movie. He's being portrayed by a CGI ape. Like, he's straight up Caesar from Planet of the Apes. And it's not like the people in the movie recognize him as a CGI ape. Like, everyone in the movie treats him like he's a regular human being. It's never once acknowledged that he looks like this. And when you combine that with director Michael Gracie, who is best known for The Greatest Showman, which I really didn't like that much at all. I think there's some great musical sequences in that movie, but as a film, I don't really like it. I just went into this one pretty pessimistic. I didn't have that much hope, but I was like, you know what? I'm gonna give this a chance. Let's see how I feel about it. And even while I was watching the movie, there were so many times where I was like, man, this just feels like a movie I shouldn't like. It just has a lot of qualities of a lot of music biopics that I really hate. Like, the movie is so by the numbers in terms of its story. You've seen this kind of thing play out a million times already. It doesn't necessarily excel at anything in any filmmaking department, but I have to give credit where credit is due. And I have to say that Better Man, for the most part, actually kind of works. Like I just said, the story is very basic, but I feel like it is told with a self-awareness that we do not ever get from people that are involved in their own biopic that are still alive. I just feel like most people try to make themselves look really good in their own movie, which makes so much sense. There's nothing more narcissistic than doing something like that. But even something like Bohemian Rhapsody, where Queen kind of portrayed Freddie Mercury in not the best light in a lot of ways, and kind of lied about how good the rest of the band members were treating each other during certain time periods. It's just a slippery slope once you're involved in a movie that either is about you or about someone you were really close to at one point in your career. And that's why I think it's fascinating that Robbie Williams decided to make himself actually look like a piece of shit in this movie, and continuously through a lot of like voiceover and stuff is like, yeah, I'm such a piece of shit. It's crazy. And there's a lot of biopics out there that do the same thing, but the difference is most of those people are dead by the time the movie comes out. And it's just so refreshing because it adds this level of authenticity that we never get from a lot of these types of movies, especially when it's something like this, where it's a story you've seen play out multiple times already. You know exactly what emotional beats it's probably going to hit throughout the entire runtime, but you never really get this sense of authenticity to it, and I really appreciate that. And since this is the guy that made The Greatest Showman, it probably shouldn't be that big of a surprise that it has a couple of incredible music sequences in here, to the point where halfway through the movie, there is a sequence that happens that I think is a one take. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it felt like it was a one take while watching it, and it is so damn good. It happens right after something nice happens to the boy band, that's all I'll say. But it got to the point where the entire audience just erupted in applause as soon as it ended, because it was one of the most well-made sequences I had seen at the entire film festival, and I thought it was worthy of the applause that it got. It's one of the best sequences I've seen in a movie all year, and there's a few that come pretty close to matching it. And besides that sequence in particular, there's just a lot of impressive visual effects going on, and I'm not even talking about just how good the CGI looks on Robbie himself, because the monkey looks good the whole time. It looks right out of Planet of the Apes, I'm telling you. But they do a lot of stuff creatively with the visuals, where even if the CGI doesn't look the best, it's still used in a creative way that makes you appreciate it. And it's not just in the visuals. I think the entire movie just oozes a lot of creativity throughout the entire time. Like, I was talking to my friend Zach from the Intercut podcast as soon as we got out of this movie as well, where he made a great point that the decision to go this bold with making Robbie Williams look like a CGI monkey really pays off, because it makes the whole argument of the actor that you pick to portray the celebrity, a lot of the times everyone complains that they don't look the same. And if you decide to just forego all of that and make the main character a CGI monkey, then yeah, I think that's a great decision. And Zach made a great point. Nobody can complain that whoever they cast doesn't look like Robbie Williams, because it's a monkey. Who cares? And in a way, that does kind of suck for the kid that ends up portraying Robbie Williams, who I can't even think of his name, Jonah Davies. I don't know who that is. He's a newcomer. I don't even know how much of the voice is him either. Like, Robbie Williams is clearly doing a lot of the voiceover stuff, and I don't know if he's doing a lot of the stuff in the movie itself or it's this other guy. Either way, it does take out the argument of, does this kid look like a young Robbie Williams? And it doesn't matter. And I have to give credit. Like, this is a type of decision that will break a lot of movies. Like, a lot of times you take a risk like that, it does not pan out at all. And I think it actually works for the movie. And I can't believe I'm saying that. And again, I don't think this is the music biopic to end all music biopics, right? It still has a lot of the same basic storytelling elements that you would expect from a movie like this. But the artist just admitting that he kind of fucked up a lot of times and it feeling like a raw, authentic piece of work really does elevate it a little bit compared to a lot of the other biopics out there. The musical sequences are pretty great to watch on a big screen, and I think the gimmick doesn't really distract you from a bad movie more than it just makes a pretty solid movie even better. I still don't love The Greatest Showman. I'm not going to sit here and defend it, even though I do like some of the sequences in there. But that being said, after watching this, I cannot wait to see what this director does next, because I think he definitely took a big step up with this one, and I'm curious to see where he goes from here. One of the hottest tickets that were so hard to get at TIFF this year was Anora, the new Sean Baker film, which I paid a pretty good price to get. It was one of those movies where I knew I had to see it when going to the festival, and even though I sat in the second row, it was awesome because I got to see pretty much the entire filmmaking team right there at the Q&A at the end. I got to meet Michael, who was a super awesome guy and turns out to be Sean Baker's biggest fan on my plane ride to Toronto. It just set the stage for a great film festival for me. I even saw Sean Baker himself the morning of my screening at a coffee shop when I was only running on caffeine. I didn't say hi because he was already talking to somebody, and I'm not gonna be that guy that goes over and goes, "Hey man, my name is Chase. I lived right by the Florida Project Hotel and I really like your movie. I can't wait to see your movie later." I'm not gonna interrupt a man's conversation by doing that. I refuse to be that guy, but regardless, I was very excited to see this movie. It was definitely one of my most anticipated of the entire year. I've seen all of the 3 previous Sean Baker films in Tangerine, The Florida Project, and Red Rocket. The Florida Project probably being my favorite of those 3, even though I didn't really like it the first time, but I really appreciated it on a rewatch. And now we have Anora, which a lot of people are already predicting is gonna be the Best Picture winner at the next Academy Awards. And it follows a New York sex worker played by Mikey Madison, and she gets involved with this Russian kid at work who happens to be the son of a very powerful family, and then shit hits the fan. And I know a lot of you have gotten the chance to see this movie already, so I don't really want to spoil it for the people that haven't gotten the chance to see it in a theater yet. But yeah, a lot of people have already said that Anora is by far the best movie of the year, and after seeing it, I can definitely see where they're coming from. The movie just delivers on nonstop energy. It's funny, it's sexy in a very clever kind of way. The pace never stops. Like, I swear to God, until about 10 minutes ago when I finished writing notes on this movie, I thought the runtime was like an hour and 40 minutes. Turns out this thing is 2 hours and 20 minutes. I don't even know how that's even possible with how fast this movie went by for me. A lot of that definitely has to do with the script, but I can't emphasize enough that the entire cast really elevates that work to probably a whole other level here. Earlier in this TIFF recap, I did mention how I don't have a strong preference yet in terms of the best actor race, but if Mikey Madison isn't the front runner for best actress this year, then what the fuck are we doing? Mikey Madison carries this movie, and the movie didn't even need to be carried, but she does it anyway. And she's so perfect in this movie to the point where it finishes and you're like, nobody else could have possibly done that. It takes so much work to pull off every single joke, every single dance move, every single dramatic beat, and yet she does it like it's no problem. She makes all 3 look super easy, and everybody else does great, don't get me wrong. But my second favorite performance has to go to Mark Edelston, don't know how you pronounce it, I'm sorry Mark, who based off the interviews is kind of just playing a crazier version of himself. And even though it's not a one-to-one comparison at all, I did used to have a French roommate at one point. Shout out to you, Leo, if you ever watch this, you're the man. But all I could think about while watching this movie was, this kid is literally Leo if Leo was rich and had a bit of a negative side to him. But I just thought this kid was so good at playing an authentic, like, foreign exchange kid. Like, I don't know how else to describe it other than he's probably playing himself. But that just goes to so much credit to Sean and his wife. But yet the energy that this guy brings to the role is so contagious and so real that even when he fucks up, you can't help but laugh and kind of love him a little bit, to the point where I can't see anybody watching this movie walking out and being like, man, the Russian kid was just so boring. It's impossible. And a lot of that has to do with Sean Baker and his wife Samantha, who's also producer on this and a lot of his other work, and just the whole casting team, because they just know how to cast their movies probably better than anybody working today. And we'll get to just how good Sean Baker is at directing those actors in a second, but I just can't emphasize enough that the energy in this movie is kind of unmatched, because Anora has the best needle drop of the entire year, and it's not even fucking close. I feel like I've listened to Greatest Day at least once a day since I've seen this movie, and every time I listen to it, I just want to ascend out of this chair. It's insane. I also feel like a lot of people criticize a lot of directors for trying to tell stories, or even not trying to tell stories, of people that are outside of their own experience. It's just really easy to make a movie feel fake. But with Sean Baker, it's just unbelievable. And it's not only how he directs this movie, but if you look at his entire body of work overall, you would think this guy has been working as a female sex worker in New York his entire life. The whole thing just feels so real and so caring that if you ask me, right, if I was watching this movie, had no idea who directed it, and you said, was that directed by a man? I would be like, fuck no. I will bet my entire checking account that there is no way a man made this movie. It would be impossible. It's just so authentic to the experience that you can't believe it by the time it's over. And I don't even think I could count enough directors on one hand how many could pull off something like that. It's a very impressive feat, and I don't know how he does it, but I keep hoping he makes whatever movies he wants to make. It doesn't matter who it's about, because it's clear that he'll make it as authentic as he possibly can. And honestly, there is only one thing that stops this from being my definitive favorite movie of 2024, and it's the fact that the second half does become a little bit repetitive for me. Like, it does introduce a good set of characters that I do really like, but it does feel like it loses a bit of the momentum it has from the first half and a long sequence in the middle of the movie. And it's not like it's a huge fall off or anything like that, but for me, it does go from, wow, this is the best movie of the year without question, to kind of like, okay, the rest of this is pretty good. And again, like, a pretty good movie is a good movie, don't get me wrong, but I do think there is a bit of a drop from the first half to the second half. Even though there are a lot of laughs that come from certain characters, trust me, as an Armenian, I appreciate some good Armenian representation, because we don't ever get it on screen. And the ending is undeniably good. I just wish there was still that same level of energy. I mean, it's not existent, or non-existent, I should say. There is still energy in that second half, but I just think the first half is just so incredible. And if the latter part of the movie lived up to that first part, this would probably be my only 5 out of 5 movie of the year. Like, I really think it's a great movie. It's probably my favorite Sean Baker movie now. I have to rewatch this and The Florida Project to kind of pick a favorite. So if this is playing in a theater near you, I don't know why you're still on this video. Stop watching it, go book a ticket, and go enjoy this movie tonight, because I don't know how people will feel when it wins Best Picture in terms of the general public, but if it does end up winning Best Picture, that is a wild fucking pick, and I won't be mad at it. One of the movies I was most pessimistic about going into TIFF was Piece by Piece, the Lego documentary about Pharrell Williams, which I didn't even realize was a documentary going into the festival. This entire time, I thought it was just a Lego biopic about his life, but turns out the director is Morgan Neville. I'm gonna go with Neville, could be wrong, but this is the same guy that brought us Won't You Be My Neighbor, the documentary about Mr. Rogers, which I thought was great. If you haven't seen it, it is something that will make you cry, that's for sure. And once I realized that, I did become a bit more optimistic, but at the same time, it was not enough for me to not think, what are we doing here? Like, why are we making a Lego Pharrell Williams movie? And after seeing the film in a packed audience with Pharrell Williams there, I have to admit, I gotta be honest, I didn't think it was the worst thing ever. In fact, there are things I definitely like about it, because there are a lot of sequences here that are really great. Like, there's a montage where Pharrell's kind of in the studio, and it's just going through all of these bangers that you have listened to a million times in your life, and you're like, holy shit, Pharrell was involved in that? That's insane. And it's in moments like that you go, okay, I understand why they would want to do this in Lego form. It visually kind of works. And that same creativity that comes with a lot of the other Lego movies is still present here. And that is something that really helps the rest of this movie pop. Like, there's a scene involving Snoop Dogg, who got interviewed for this, and obviously they can't have Lego Snoop Dogg smoking a blunt on camera. It's just not gonna happen. So they have all these Lego production assistants come in and spray all this PG stuff all over the screen. It just says PG spray. That's hilarious. And whenever the movie would do little stuff like that, I thought it worked the best. That's when I was like, okay, this is a unique idea. I'm kind of not hating it. And there were so many things I didn't know about Pharrell that I ended up actually appreciating. Like, he did the for McDonald's. That's crazy. I can't believe he cooked like that. But even after appreciating all of those aspects about the documentary, I still came out feeling like, this is fine. And even with all of those creative things, to me, this still just felt like a stretched out YouTube video about Pharrell that they just turned into Lego form. It's almost like the Legos are being used to mask a very mid movie. Like, it's almost the opposite effect of when I was talking about Better Man, where Better Man had the CGI monkey thing and it was kind of weird, but the movie itself was still solid and the CGI ape kind of elevated the movie. I feel like the opposite happens here, where the film they wanted to make was very whatever, and they're like, but if we make it Lego, maybe people will think it's interesting. And again, I don't hate it. I don't want it to come across like I thought this was terrible. I thought it was going to be pointless going into the movie, and even though the film itself feels like it should be a lot shorter, I do think the Legos aspect of it elevates the entire thing. Even if that elevation might not actually be elevation, it might just be trying to hide a whatever movie. And I do get why people love it. I think there's a lot to love about it. I just would never want to sit through this again. And I do think there's a lot of good humor. I think there's a lot of good sequences. I would just be lying to you if I was sitting here being like, man, you gotta go see Piece by Piece, the Lego Pharrell Williams biopic / documentary. It's actually a documentary. It's not a biopic. I would say save your money, but if it seems interesting to you, go for it. I also saw Megalopolis, which I already have a video on the channel about that you could go check out. This was not only my least favorite of the festival, not only my least favorite of the year, but also just one of the most unpleasant experiences of my entire life. I think a lot of people are more interested in being the person that is perceived of thinking that Megalopolis is a masterpiece rather than actually believing that Megalopolis is a masterpiece. And yeah, I talk about my whole viewing experience with that in a video that'll be linked down below. Yeah. Fuck this movie. Another film I got to see earlier than a lot of people, though, was Babygirl, which is a new film from A24 starring Nicole Kidman, Harris Dickinson, and Antonio Banderas. And it's a plot that's pretty simple. Kidman plays this high-end CEO that starts an affair with an intern that is played by Dickinson. And I was really excited for this because it comes from director Helena Rain. I could have pronounced that wrong. Sorry if I did. But her last film that she did was Bodies, 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 which was definitely one of my favorite movies of 2022. I thought it was so much fun. It was a great horror comedy. And I will say, if you were a fan of that movie and you were going into this expecting a follow-up to that in the same kind of style, these could not be more different. So check your expectations at the door, because Babygirl, even though it does have some comedic moments, like, you're never gonna not laugh in this movie. It's got some of those awkward moments that Bodies, Bodies, Bodies had, but this is definitely way more in the drama category. There's a lot more serious stuff going on. So definitely check your expectations at the door, but I always get excited when a director tries to broaden their range, I guess, and try something completely different. And even though I think she does a solid job with directing this movie, I don't think Babygirl necessarily ever exceeds just a solid movie, at least for me, because I always get a little bit let down by movies that don't really exceed what we think they are going to be, and they kind of just deliver every beat that you would expect the movie to deliver on. Like I mentioned earlier in this TIFF recap, that Joshua Oppenheimer's The End, which is a movie about a rich family that is stuck in a bunker at the end of the world, it didn't really do anything you wouldn't think it would touch on in terms of that exact subject. And with Babygirl, when you hear that Nicole Kidman and Harris Dickinson are having a sort of kinky affair, that's kind of all you get. Like, you don't really get much deeper than what you would expect with that premise that is just sold to you. And don't get me wrong, it's a good version of that. Like, both of these actors crush their roles. I mean, Nicole Kidman, she makes movies better. We know that already. Harris Dickinson is one of those people I said a long time ago, and I never get this right, so I'm proud that I called this very early on. He was an indie actor that I knew, like, man, this guy just has so much potential, because I've been a huge cheerleader of the movie Beach Rats from 2017 ever since I saw it back then. I think it's a really great movie. If you haven't seen it, it is super underrated. underrated. I hope you like it. But when I watched him in that lead role, I was like, holy shit, this guy is super talented, and I can't wait to see what happens next. And now he's kind of here, and he's getting bigger and bigger roles, and he definitely deserves them. He's super talented, and he's really good in here, but they both do an excellent job. And I feel like nobody's talking about Antonio Banderas because maybe they don't want to get too involved with the movie. I don't really know if they want to dive super deep, but he's in the movie, and he's really, really fucking good, to the point where I would say he might be the best performance in here. It's a very patient performance. Like, he doesn't have nearly as much screen time as the other two, but when he delivers, he fucking delivers. So performance-wise, I think the entire ensemble is great, but I don't think the story itself lives up to their performances. Or I should say, like, the plot itself doesn't live up to the story that they try and sell from the second you hear about this movie. At least for me, nothing ever came off as surprising. Like, there's maybe you could say certain directions the movie tries to go, but I would never be surprised like going into this movie thinking it would have done anything differently. I was expecting it to do something different, and it never really did. And every scene feels solid. It's not like you're watching the movie and you're like, man, this is just not good. No, it's solid the entire time. It just never really over delivers on anything for me. And obviously the movie has a lot of sex and dirty talk in there, and a lot of people were coming out of this like, man, that movie really goes for it, huh? And maybe I'm just crazy, but I was sitting there like, yeah, like, sure, there's sex in the movie, they talk dirty, nothing fucking wild to me. Like, yeah, they do a couple things, and it's one of those things, you do a double take, you're like, but nothing where I was like, oh my God, I didn't think that was possible. And I would say maybe in this review, let's move on from the sex stuff and talk about something else. But I don't think Babygirl gives you too much to chew on that. Yeah, like, you watch the movie, you're like, the movie's good, and it kind of ends. It's solid, it's sexy, and it's probably a 6 out of 10 for me. I won't be thinking about it that much a year from now. It sounds like a lot of people that came out of the festival really enjoyed it. I'm sure I'll take my girlfriend because she's probably interested in this movie because of Bodies, Buys, Bodies, and I get it. It's a sellable premise. I won't be mad that I have to watch it again. I think it will be solid, but I don't think I'll walk out of that movie the second time and be like, man, that is incredible. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I feel that way on the second watch, but I definitely prefer the previous movie that the director worked on. The Piano Lesson is the newest August Wilson adaptation for Netflix. And if you don't know, a lot of Wilson's previous adaptations include Fences and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. But this specific adaptation is directed by Denzel Washington's son, Malcolm, and stars John David Washington, Daniel Deadwyler, Samuel L. Jackson, Ray Fisher, Corey Hawkins. I mean, the cast is pretty stacked, and the story, you're going to be shocked when you hear this, revolves around a piano, and it's about the piano's history among the family, and there are like many debates about what to do with the piano. And I've got to be honest, I was kind of looking forward to this, but I really did not like Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. I thought that was just a very boring movie. I just thought it was such a chore to sit through. So when I had a screening for this at like 9 p.m. in the middle of the festival where you're starting to feel really tired, I was really hoping I was going to be blown away by this one and come out being like, you know what? I'm going to read everything from August Wilson. So if it's that time of night, that deep into the festival, if a movie is not captivating you constantly, you are going to start to kind of disassociate a little bit. I'm not even saying like drift off or like fall asleep. I'm just saying it got to the point where there are certain times in the movie I'm watching it and I'm like, it just isn't that good. I'm not saying it's like a bad movie. I thought I ended up feeling okay about it, but when the film isn't clicking and you spend more time thinking to yourself, man, this film isn't clicking, and you spend more time doing that than actually watching the movie, that's a problem. And maybe that's a problem with me as a viewer, maybe that's a problem of me needing more sleep, but maybe it's a problem of the movie just not being super interesting. And I don't even think The Piano Lesson is a poorly made movie. I think Malcolm Washington does a pretty solid job directing it. He does a good job working with his actors, and this is one of the few plays, I would say, especially in terms of these adaptations, where it doesn't necessarily feel like just a play. It feels more cinematic than that. I was talking to Ryan Castleman, who has a YouTube channel that I literally discovered the week before I left for TIFF. I just happened to be sitting next to him during this screening, and the only time I've literally talked to him was literally before and after this movie, but he was a super nice guy, and he brought up the point that, yeah, compared to like Ma Rainey's Black Bottom or even Fences, this just feels a lot more like it's supposed to be a movie compared to those other adaptations, and I 100% agree with that take. And he brought up this other good point that neither of us really saw coming, where there's a lot of like genre elements to this that I don't want to spoil until you see the movie. But it got to the point where I woke the fuck up. If I was drifting off, there are things that happen here. I was like, whoa, okay, we're going for this kind of movie now. But I think when the film is working in that kind of genre, it kind of shows how good these adaptations can be. But at the same time, even though while I was watching this, I was like, okay, this is clearly better than Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, without question. But I could still never shake the feeling of, man, this part of the movie just keeps feeling like a play. And that is just such a huge hurdle to get over for any sort of just straight up play adaptation. Like Sweeney Todd, that's easy to adapt. It's a musical. Musicals are bigger in scope. They got big songs that you could portray on screen. It's easier to adapt into a movie, but I've seen so many other play to movie adaptations that I think are just way better. Like I know to compare Malcolm Washington to Denis Villeneuve this late in his career versus this early in Malcolm's career, it's a little unfair, but I just think Incendies is such a better movie and it doesn't feel like a play versus something like this just feels like a play. It's one of those movies where I don't have a lot of bad to say about it. Like, it doesn't give me enough bad things to say about it. The performances are all solid from everybody. I do think Danielle Deadwyler is by far the standout. If anyone's getting Academy buzz from this movie, it's definitely her. And like I said, there are sequences that definitely hook you, but I never felt captivated by the piano lesson as a whole movie. It never made me fall in love with the characters. I never really got too invested in the story. And at the end of the day, this just feels like a movie your history teacher would put on in high school while he's grading papers in the background. If you really like Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, I think you'll love this movie. It's probably gonna be one of your favorites of the entire year, and I'm not even saying that sarcastically. I think you'll really genuinely like it, and I know there's a lot of people that really like these types of movies, but it's just not something that's for me, and unless you're into that kind of movie, I probably wouldn't really recommend it to anybody. I also got to see the new film Bring Them Down, which stars Christopher Abbott and Barry Keoghan, and the only thing people knew about this movie before it premiered at the festival was that it starred these two and it had this picture of both of them by a truck. And my initial feeling based off that picture was, okay, this is going to be like a spiritual successor to Banshees of Inisherin because Barry was in that film. You know, a dark Irish buddy comedy kind of movie. That was the vibe that I was getting from the picture. And maybe you follow two friends that go back and forth for an entire movie, and these two characters definitely go back and forth the entire movie. That part is for sure, but it's definitely not in a comedic way at all. And I don't really want to dive into what the movie is actually about because I think if I say what is so disturbing about the movie, it spoils what the movie is. So I don't want to spoil the entire thing, but I also don't want you to go into this movie if you are iffy on any kind of violence. And what I mean by that is, like, on a good day, if you're like, man, I could kind of handle Kill Bill, where it's like a fun kind of movie violence, but on a bad day, you're like, I can't see an ounce of blood, I would probably skip this one. Because once a particular scene plays out, there were a lot of walkouts in my screening. And even though I didn't walk out, I definitely went like, oh, okay, I guess this is what the movie's about. And like I said, when there's a film festival, you don't really know too much about a movie going in, so I wonder if the trailer is gonna kind of mention what it's actually about. But I could totally understand why somebody would go into this blind, and then once they realize what the movie's about, they're like, yeah, fuck this, I'm not gonna sit through that. But if you are someone that could stomach violence, and not the fun kind of violence, just violence in general in a movie, like, even though Terrifier 3 is a very fucked up movie, it's still in the category of like fun violence for a lot of people. This is definitely not that. This is definitely realistic, uncomfortable stuff. And if that is something you can handle, I do think you would get a pretty good low budget movie out of sitting through this. They present the story in a very interesting kind of timeline where it'll change something and you don't really realize things have changed. And then 10 minutes later you go, oh shit, they did this. Okay, that's kind of interesting. And a lot of screenplays never really pull that off effectively. So when somebody does pull that off, I definitely want to shout it out. I thought they played with a timeline in a very interesting, clever, and well done way. I also really appreciate Barry for taking the smaller kind of stuff. Like, Christopher Abbott's been the indie darling for like the past 5 years. Ever since the first Sundance I went to in 2019, he's in like all those indie movies. So he's been killing it in that scene for a while. But I feel like Barry's at the point of his career where he could easily just be doing the Eternals and the Joker in the new Batman movie and just be getting the high paid roles, and that's all he does. But I appreciate when an actor takes the time to do the smaller stuff like this and just be really good in a role like this, or Bird, which I'll talk about in a bit, because I would imagine the check for this movie is minuscule compared to a lot of those other movies. And I appreciate him and Christopher doing this because they're both great in the movie. They bounce off each other in a really unique way, and I thought they were both excellent. I don't really have much to say in this video because I feel like going into specifics kind of ruins the whole movie. So if this is something that sounds intriguing from the way I talked about it, it is pretty much picked up by Mubi. I don't know if they made it or they're just distributing it, but it will be on Mubi at some point soon. And if you are someone that's interested in pretty dark, low-budget dramas, I think you're gonna walk out of this one saying, you know what, that was pretty good. I also got to attend the world premiere of Hold Your Breath, which is a horror film you could already check out on Hulu if you're watching the TIFF recap at this point. It stars Sarah Paulson as this mother who's trying to raise her family during the Oklahoma Dust Bowl back in the 30s, which I think is a pretty interesting setting for a horror movie. And it's a horror movie because there's this element of the gray man, which the kids are reading about in this storybook. He might be real, he might not be real. It's a horror movie. I think you could figure it out. And since I read the synopsis, I thought this could be an interesting horror movie, so I was very excited. I really like Sarah Paulson. I like unique settings for horror movies. And within about 20 minutes, I knew, okay, this movie's not going to be that great. And then about 45 minutes into the movie, I said, okay, this movie's not even going to be decent. This is just a bad horror movie. I'll give the setting another shout out because I really do like the idea of where the movie is set. And in the filmmaker's defense, I think there's a couple moments where they do take advantage of that setting. And when you have a main talent in Sarah Paulson, who I've always liked, and she's always consistently great in horror-related projects, I just think it's really hard to make a bad horror movie. And that is somehow what they pulled off. I think the worst crime a scary movie can commit is just flat out being boring. Because I've sat through a lot of bad horror movies in my lifetime, but even a lot of the bad ones, I find it hard to at least not be engaged with the entire time, because the whole point of them is to scare you. So even if you know the movie is bad, I feel like there's still a lot of them where you're at least locked into what's happening a little bit because you know at least a jump scare is gonna pop out. But I was yawning my ass off for this movie to the point where it's full of jump scares. It's not like there's no jump scares and that's not why I'm locked in. This has some of the cheapest jump scares I've seen in years. Like, remember in the 2010s when all the YouTube movie reviewers were like, oh my god, this movie sucked, it was just jump scares. That was like the main complaint of a lot of horror movies back in that decade. And I feel like this decade so far, we haven't had to complain about that as much. Like, sure, there's a lot of cheap horror movies that are still made that use that technique to just get cheap scares out of you. But I feel like it hasn't been that prominent of an issue, at least for the movies I've seen in quite a few years. So when you get something like Hold Your Breath that has the cheapest jump scares imaginable the entire time, then yeah, it stands out like a sore thumb. And in a way, this kind of reminds me of how I felt about The Purge when I saw The Purge, because that had a great concept and it did nothing with it. Hold Your Breath is kind of like that, but in the sense that the setting has potential, not the actual story they're trying to tell. But even the story they're trying to tell, I could still see being good at some point. But when you hand this story to two filmmakers that barely have any experience at all, it's really tough to sit through. Even if one of those directors is the screenwriter behind this whole thing, so clearly they had all the creative power they could have. So maybe if you handed this script and this story to a completely different filmmaking team, it could have actually been pretty good or something special at least. I think this is a very skippable movie. I didn't hear a single positive word of mouth coming out of the theater, and even if you have Hulu, I don't think you should waste your time on this. I also got to see The Brutalist, which has become one of the most talked about movies of the entire year. It's been the hardest movie to get a ticket for at all of these film festivals. And even before it premiered at Venice, I had this on my short list of the top 10 movies I knew I had to see at TIFF, just because it's a over 3-hour epic. Those movies tend to be in the Oscar conversation, at least most of those years. So I thought The Brutalist could be on that list of like, oh, this is like the 10th movie that gets nominated for Best Picture. But man, has it exploded in terms of hype and anticipation and just becoming one of the biggest Oscar contenders already this year. At the time of recording this video, it seems like Anora and The Brutalist are kind of the two Best Picture frontrunners at the moment. And with that, I have a lot of thoughts about The Brutalist, and I'm going to get into all my thoughts about the movie. But before I do that, I just want to rant about a couple things with you for a few minutes, because if there is one thing you should take from this huge, long TIFF recap that I made, I think that reviewing movies on YouTube in this kind of format, or just any format in general, it doesn't even just have to be YouTube, but when you're reviewing a movie you've only seen once, you're not really reviewing a movie. For the most part, you're usually just giving your first impressions of a movie. Like, there's certain ones you see them and you're like, yeah, this is really shit. And there's other ones you see, you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely great. But to get into like all the nitty gritty details of everything, of how you feel about a certain movie, I feel like you need to watch them at least twice. So if you want to grow on YouTube, I think you have to get your thoughts out as soon as possible. It's just part of the game. You can't wait forever, like I did with this TIFF recap video, of getting your stuff out, because you don't really grow as a channel. You need to be on it. You need to have your opinions ready to go. And the most talented people out there can have a definitive opinion the second they walk out of a theater. And if I had the power to give videos the same amount of views 2 months after a movie comes out versus the weekend it comes out, then yeah, I would take my time and watch a movie 3 times before I talked about it on YouTube. But that's just not realistic. We also are human beings. We don't have time to watch every movie we see 3 times. But regardless of if I liked a movie or not, I still want to tell you guys what I thought about a movie. You know, when I walk out, is it something you should go out and see absolutely immediately? Is it something you should save your money on and wait till it comes on streaming? Is it something like Hold Your Breath, which you should just skip entirely, whether you have the streaming service or not? And I also think if you are one of these people that goes to these film festivals and you're one of the first people in the world to see this movie and you're in charge of recommending movies to your large audience, I do think a lot of people are ready to make bold claims as soon as they walk out of a theater. Because if you are one of the first people to see The Brutalist, The Wild Robot, Anora, Saturday Night, all these movies that had a lot of hype coming out of film festivals, you also want to be one of those first people that gets the word out about that movie, whether it's hype or not hype, or you're saying it's not good or it's the best movie of the year, whatever it is. I understand why people want to get that word out before everybody else. And whether somebody actually believes that opinion or not that they put out is up to interpretation. I do think pretty much every critic out there is authentic with their reaction to movies. But this was my first film festival that I got to attend as press. So when you're in those press lines, you get to talk to people that are also in the press. And when you're waiting in line for an hour for a movie, you naturally start talking to people next to you in line and you ask like, oh, what are some of your favorite movies of the festival? Like, what are you most looking forward to? Those basic conversations, because we're all there for the same thing. We all love movies. We all want to learn about the movies that we should all be seeing at that festival. And I got to attend the last screening of The Brutalist because there were only 3 total screenings that entire like 10 days of the festival, which is absolutely crazy. There was 1 press screening that was first, and then there were 2 public screenings. I got to attend that second public screening, so everyone at TIFF that saw The Brutalist pretty much saw it before me, which means I got to talk to a lot of people that saw it at that very first press screening. So anytime I ran into one of those people, I would be like, oh, what did you think of The Brutalist? Because it was the most hyped up movie coming out of Venice and kind of going into this film festival. And I could count on my hand probably 4 or 5 people that when I asked that, they said, yeah, it was pretty good. Or it'd be something like, yeah, I really liked it. Or something like, you know what? I liked it, but I definitely have to see it a second time. Stuff like that in that realm of conversation, which is a super valid reaction to watching a movie. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about The Brutalist before we get into all of my thoughts. But when you have conversations with those people, and then you check Letterboxd or Twitter or whatever, and you see that person give it a 5 out of 5 or a 9 out of 10, you start to lose your mind a little bit. It makes you go like, what the fuck were you talking about when we were talking about the movie? I thought you said you kind of liked it. I get shit on by a lot of people about my Letterboxd ratings. It's what it is. I don't really take it that seriously. I have The Cat in the Hat as a 4 out of 5 and The Brutalist a 3 out of 5 at the moment. I don't take it that seriously. It's just how I feel about movies in the moment. And during those conversations at Toronto and then seeing scores of the movie after, it did kind of confirm a little bit of speculation I've always had about certain critics. And that is that you could put a lot of critics or content creators into pretty much one of 2 spaces. You have the person that no matter what the movie is, their opinion is 99% out of 100 times going to be the same as the general public. Like if the movie has a 3.5 on Letterboxd, insert name of critic is going to have a 3.5 on Letterboxd. Then you have the other side, which is always going to go against the general opinion of movies so they can get their writing or video shared a lot more on social media. Again, I've heard of people that kind of shit on movies like Deadpool and Wolverine. I don't care if you like Deadpool or Wolverine or not. I thought it was fine. But to write an article on why it's ruining cinema and how Marvel has just ruined movies and this is the worst thing of the entire year theater, even though I know people that were at that screening with that person and they said that person was cracking up at all of the jokes. It makes me question who you should follow. That's all I'm saying. I do feel like a lot of people kind of group me into that second group of people, and if that's how you feel about me, I'm sorry. Maybe this isn't the channel for you. But I never enjoy when I don't like something as much as everybody else does. I think a lot of people think I enjoy ranting about certain movies, and sometimes it is fun. Like if I genuinely think a movie's terrible, like I like to rant about that. I also like to rant about the movies I absolutely love, and I'm also somebody that thinks a lot of movies that a lot of people think are great are just fine. But there's a lot of times I have been on the record of saying I was wrong about movies. Like there are a ton of modern movies that people loved when they came out, and I said, yeah, they're pretty good. Movies like Call Me By Your Name, La La Land, The Fabelmans, Oppenheimer. I really liked them when I saw them the first time, but I wasn't blown away by them. But after I rewatched each of those, I loved them. They are some of my favorite movies of the past 10 years. Call Me By Your Name is one of my favorite movies of all time. But I would also not go back and be like, oh yeah, I always loved Call Me By Your Name. My first Letterboxd review remains the same. You know, I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was overhyped at the time. But then you go through some different life things, or you just see movies through a different lens, and you're like, holy shit, that's one of the best movies I've ever seen. So when I tell you right now that I thought The Brutalist was a good movie, believe me when I tell you, I thought The Brutalist was a pretty good movie. It has been the one film from TIFF that I've given a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd, and I keep debating, it might be a 3.5. It's like right on the cusp. I am somebody, when I feel that way about a movie, I tend to round down a bit. And the reason I want to bump it to a 3.5 out of 5 is that everything on a technical level is what I want modern movies to kind of be. And there's clearly so much thought being put behind every single choice of this movie. I mean, this is directed by Brady Corbett, and the only other thing I have seen from him is Vox Lux. I know he's been an actor before, but in terms of directing, that was the only thing I've seen. I watched it on the plane to Toronto, which is, by the way, one of the worst movies you could watch on a plane. I thought it was really about Natalie Portman just being a cringy pop star. I was so wrong within the first 5 minutes. I had old people looking at my iPad like, what the fuck is this kid watching? But even if it's not the best airplane movie, I thought Vox Lux was absolutely great. So when you combine my Vox Lux love with the hype from Venice, with this is a 3-hour epic, I'm sold. Like, this became my most anticipated film of the festival besides Megalopolis, and Megalopolis ended up being a lot worse than I thought it would be. So I did put a lot of hope into The Brutalist kind of being the savior of Toronto. There's just been so much talk about how this is one of the best movies ever made, and I really try my best to avoid hype for movies. Like, I don't watch trailers. That's a big thing for me. If trailers are playing during a theater, I tend to be on my phone until the trailers turn off. I try to avoid conversations on film Twitter about how good a movie is before it comes out, but I'm a movie fan. Like, I naturally want to be in those conversations. I naturally want to get excited for movies. It's just in my DNA. And especially for a movie like this, when everybody walks out of it comparing it to the scale of The Godfather and There Will Be Blood. Like, people are saying this is the next Godfather. This is the next There Will Be Blood. Those are bold fucking words, and everybody was saying them. And I do understand where people are coming from, because the epicness of this immigrant story, you can compare kind of to There Will Be Blood, and the look and feel of this movie does feel like something that was made in the 70s, in the same year as The Godfather. I understand those comparisons. But just because a movie looks and feels like it is one of the most important in cinema history recently, that doesn't mean we should automatically group it with two of inarguable classics when it comes to best movies ever made. When you're behind two guys in line talking and one guy goes, oh, did you see The Brutalist? And the other guy goes, oh my God, man, There Will Be Blood is my favorite movie. You see my phone background? It's Daniel Plainview. It's the best movie I've ever seen, and The Brutalist is the second best movie I've ever seen. This, I swear to God, this is how people were talking. I think this was in line for Piece by Piece. I heard two guys talking about it. Like, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was like, okay, this movie has to be that good. And I don't know, maybe some people have a lot of influence and people start repeating each other over and over again at film festivals. I've never heard There Will Be Blood more in the past 15 years or whatever it's been since it came out, other than comparing it to The Brutalist. But I think placing The Brutalist next to The Godfather and There Will Be Blood does absolutely no favors to anybody who, like me at the time, hasn't seen The Brutalist yet. There's a lot of people waiting to see this movie, expecting the next There Will Be Blood, expecting the next Godfather. And I think that's setting up a lot of people for disappointment, because when I think of The Godfather and when I think of There Will Be Blood, those two movies give me a very specific feeling of what I should expect. And I know that feeling is hard to capture, because because that is why The Godfather and There Will Be Blood never come out every year. It's because they are such specific masterpieces. And when everybody online is saying this is a once-in-a-generation movie, you have to go see this, this is truly one of the best ever made, yes, there is a certain expectation to live up to. And I get very excited to see what is potentially one of the best movies ever made. And I'm very happy for the people that genuinely feel that way. I am stoked for the people that think this is one of the best movies of the year. I do think there's a lot of people that truly do love this movie. But I think if somebody in my personal life came up to me and said, yo, Chase, There Will Be Blood and The Godfather, two of my favorite movies, what is a movie you would recommend? The Brutalist wouldn't even be on the top 50 recommendations, I feel like. Because The Brutalist is not something that's nearly as accessible as There Will Be Blood or The Godfather. And I don't even think it's trying to be that. I think what Brady Corbett is going for is being completely misinterpreted by just critics that love to put quotes out there that could make a movie poster or a trailer, because there's a reason The Godfather is regarded by a lot of general public people, like people that aren't into movies like us, people that aren't interested in watching YouTube videos about movies but still enjoy a good movie every once in a while. There is a reason a lot of those people say The Godfather is the best movie ever made. It's not only because the craft is top notch, it's because it is something that anybody could hop into, and it's a genuinely exciting movie the entire time. The Brutalist is a much quieter, much subtler movie than those two. There aren't people getting shot in restaurants, and there's no "I abandoned my child" monologue in this movie. The Brutalist doesn't have anything like that. It really takes its time trying to tell you the story of this Holocaust survivor that's trying to restart their life in America, and they're trying to deal with the ups and downs of chasing the American dream. And to me, it just feels like a pretty good story that's told with the top of the line craftsman when it comes to independent filmmaking. And to me, when we're talking about The Brutalist, those aspects of the movie 100% live up to the hype. Because when I was watching this movie, I was absolutely blown away with the entire look of it. It was shot on 35mm. It was blown up to 70mm, which I got to see it projected on, and it looked absolutely beautiful. And when you are watching it, it is impossible to deny that this is the best looking movie of the entire year, especially when you take into account that the budget is like under $10 million. Because sure, there are movies I love this year like Dune Part 2, which look incredible. They have huge budgets behind them. But for what this team accomplished with the little amount of money they had, every movie should look and feel like this. It's ridiculous. Because I'll be honest, when they revealed that it cost around $10 million to make this movie, I was about to call the IRS and have them audit every other studio working today. Because when movies like Red One are being made for $250 million, we have a serious issue that we have to address. It's absolutely ludicrous, and the actual look of the cinematography is not the only thing that makes this movie beautiful to look at. It's the lighting, the costume design, the composition of the shots. Everything technical is beautiful to look at. And since Adrian Brody plays an architect, it shouldn't be any shocker that the production design also looks incredible here. If I were the sole voter of the Academy this year, I would still personally give Dune Part 2 a lot of the technical awards. But if The Brutalist starts sweeping in a lot of those categories with the minuscule budget that they had, I can't be mad at that. I completely understand why that would be praised, because it absolutely deserves it. And again, with Dune Part 2, it has still my favorite score of the year. But the Brutalist theme goes so fucking hard. You hear it and instantly you feel like you've heard it 1,000 times before, which is why I get why some people are comparing this to so many classic movies, because it does such a good job at mimicking the classic film feel. All of those things combined really makes the scale of the movie feel a lot bigger than it actually is. And I think a lot of that credit has to go to Brady Corbett. And even though I still like Vox Lux a lot more than I do The Brutalist, these two movies back to back really has me curious about what the hell this guy can do next, because even though I don't love this as much as everybody else yet, I do think this makes him one of the most interesting up-and-coming directors to keep our eye on. You also can't talk about this movie without talking about the performances, specifically the two that everybody is talking about, starting with Adrian Brody. I mentioned earlier in the recap that I didn't have a huge preference between Brody and Fiennes for Conclave, but if we're being honest, I would still probably give it to Brody over Ralph Fiennes. I love that guy. He's great in Conclave, but Adrian Brody's really fucking good here. I would probably give him Best Actor this year, but my whole thing is, I don't know how to put this in perspective other than saying that imagine he does win Best Actor. I wouldn't put him in the all-time greats of Best Actor winners. He'd probably be like mid-tier to like kind of lower mid-tier. Like if there's 90 plus people that have won this award, he'd probably be in the 40s, even though I haven't seen every Best Actor performance. I also think Guy Pearce is absolutely excellent in this. He's always been one of those actors that I think deserve to be bigger than he already is. But man, every ounce of talent in that man's body shows up here. I've seen a few people say that his performance is a bit overdone, but I completely disagree. I thought he kind of nailed exactly what the film was calling for him to do, and he was probably my favorite performance in this movie. In terms of actors that didn't live up to the hype for me personally, I did not think Joe Alwyn was all that great. He plays Guy Pearce's son, I believe, and he just came across so cringy for me. Like, I don't know, there's something about when you play the snobby rich kid and you talk like this, but you talk like a dick. I don't know, like, I feel like that's an easy role to nail, but he just was so kind of goofy with it. Like the performance itself, he's not really doing goofy things, but him trying to do it comes across as goofy for me. Maybe my mind will change on that on a rewatch. I thought he was kind of cringy and nowhere near the level of the other two. Along with Felicity Jones, who I have nothing really against Felicity Jones, but she comes in the second half of the movie and she's just not on the same level as the main two. Like, you watch the first half, and Adrian Brody and Guy Pearce are so fucking good. And then Felicity Jones shows up, starts talking, you're like, okay, that's a bit of a step down, but okay, you know, she's fine. And maybe like Joe Alwyn, you know, my mind will change on a rewatch, and I'll really think all the performances are on the same level. I just think when you have somebody performing on that wave, you need somebody that could kind of match that energy. And I think Guy Pearce and Adrian Brody match each other, but the other two just, they feel like they're in a different movie. I just know the caliber that Brody and Pearce brings, those two did not for me. I think you could have found two actors that fit that better. And honestly, I don't think it's Felicity Jones that did it, but once she shows up in the movie, that's when I started to lose a little bit of interest in the entire thing, because the first half of this movie, flies by. Like, I couldn't believe the intermission happened when it did, because I thought we still had another hour before the intermission was going to happen. And you really have this sense of momentum going into the second half of like, wow, we are on this epic ride of this guy's life. I can't wait to see what goes right, what goes wrong. You have the feeling that something is being promised that is going to happen. And instead of that momentum continuing to build in the first half into the second, it kind of like plateaus for a bit and then it like goes down a bit. Like, I don't think the second half of The Brutalist is bad. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think the first half is so good at feeling like it's going to deliver something, and then the second half kind of just keeps doing that, but not in a satisfying way anymore. And by the end, I was not satisfied with how this movie wrapped up, because you think this buildup is going to be worth it, and then the ending hits you, and I know some people like it. I thought the ending was kind of a joke, and even the scene right before the ending, I was like, okay, like, that's it? That's what we've been building to this entire time? But the absolute last scene, without getting into any spoilers, I thought was a huge letdown. And I really thought it was made by a different filmmaker at one point. I just couldn't believe this was the same guy that gave us everything prior in this specific movie. Like, I am definitely excited to give The Brutalist a rewatch. I'm excited to see what little things I didn't pick up on, whether it be early in the movie or the second half of the movie. I'm excited to see if Joe Alwyn and Felicity Jones change my mind. But I am fairly confident I am not going to do a 180 on the ending. I just don't find it satisfying whatsoever. And I think that's kind of the point of what they're trying to say in the ending, but that doesn't make me like your ending. So again, I do want to emphasize, I think The Brutalist lives up to the words like masterpiece and best of the decade if we're talking about all of the technical aspects of it. It's almost like finding somebody attractive on the outside is definitely important, but what's on the inside is what's most important. And The Brutalist is the hottest movie of the year, but the personality is so whatever. And I know there are people out there that feel that way. Their online scores just don't reflect that. It feels like they are obligated to say that they think the movie is great because that's what everybody expects them to say. And again, if you love The Brutalist, it genuinely touched your soul, I am very happy for you. I read some of my friends' reviews and I'm like, oh yeah, they fucking loved it. And that is awesome. I'm not trying to be right here. I'm just trying to give you my honest takes. That's my whole point of making a YouTube channel ever since I started this back in freshman year of high school. I just want to talk about movies. I love talking about movies. I think The Brutalist is an objectively good movie with a lot of great things in it. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people genuinely think this is the best movie of the year. I know this and Anora are the two frontrunners for Best Picture. Even though I like Anora a lot more,
I think The Brutalist is kind of a more deserving Best Picture winner because it signifies this shift that is happening in independent cinema. I think we're at a point right now where we're going to stop paying actors $30 million, upping the budget of a movie, underpaying everyone else working on the project, and then we can't make movies anymore because everyone is using this as a money laundering service. I think we're going to see a shift where people take a bit of a pay cut to actually make something meaningful, and then you can keep making a bunch of meaningful things rather than getting 2 huge paychecks and then you kill the industry for good. And just knowing that this was made for about $10 million, it really helps me hold out faith. You know, there's a lot of people that want to make movies. I want to make movies. That's the whole point of me talking about movies. It's something I want to get involved in the future. And I know how much work it takes. I know how much sacrifice you have to put into it. I know how hard it is to get a movie made. So to see that something like this can possibly be made for $10 million is such an optimistic thing for me. But with all of that being said, I can praise all of those aspects of this movie. But if I still walked out of there and said, yeah, you know what, that was pretty good, that's what I'm going to tell you in this video. I'm not going to pretend like I loved it. That's not me. That will never be me. And if you have a problem with me saying that about The Brutalist, maybe you didn't love the movie as much as you thought you did. And I'm hoping to see it in theaters again one more time. And I genuinely believe that there is a chance I could walk out of that second screening and be like, damn, that really does live up to all the hype. I also got to see Bird, the newest film from Andrea Arnold, and in terms of her filmography, me and her have a pretty interesting relationship because the first thing I saw from her was American Honey, which was by far one of my most anticipated movies back in 2016. The trailer was absolutely incredible for that movie, and if we're talking about movies, speaking of The Brutalist, that I know I have to rewatch, American Honey is at the top of that list for me because I remember walking out of the film and being like, that was okay. Like, there were a lot of things I did like about it, but it was just way too long. And on top of that, it had some thematic moments that were kind of goofy that they went for. I just really love the first half of American Honey, and the rest of it kind of loses it for me. Then in film school, my favorite professor showed us Wasp, her 2003 short film, and besides World of Tomorrow, that is probably my favorite short I have ever seen. It's been about 7 years or 8 years at this point since I've seen it, so maybe my opinion would change if I rewatched it, but the filmmaking in that clearly set the foundation of what you would see later in movies like Fish Tank and Bird, and to this day, it just is one of the best things I've seen in the entire century, and I would say it's still my favorite thing that she has made. And in terms of Fish Tank, I actually saw that recently. I wanted to make sure I watched it before I saw Bird, and I really enjoyed that one as well. But just like I felt with American Honey, I thought it maybe felt a little bit too long, and then also it does a couple goofy things with the character. And now we have Bird, which is Andrea Arnold's first film in 8 years since American Honey, and it feels like a companion piece to Fish Tank in a lot of ways. Like, I don't know, the visuals, the setting, the age of the protagonist, all of that stuff is almost the same, except the main characters in both of those movies do feel like two completely different people. And if there is one thing Andrea Arnold excels at compared to every other living filmmaker, it's making a coming-of-age story about a young woman that looks visually incredible. I love the way all of her movies look, and that's because she's worked with the same cinematographer, Robbie Ryan, since that short film in Wasp. And he has gone on to collaborate with Yorgos Lanthimos, making some of the most well-shot movies of the last 10 years in stuff like The Favorite, Kinds of Kindness, and Poor Things. So it's no wonder that all of her movies are some of the best looking independent work of the past few years by a mile. But just like The Brutalist, her movies just have a very specific style that make the film look more expensive than it actually is. The Brutalist definitely looks bigger in terms of scale, but I do think there are very few filmmakers that are able to make their movies look this good at an independent, low budget kind of level, and Andrea Arnold has just consistently excelled at that. In Bird, I also think that all of the acting is pretty great, which is also nothing really new for an Andrea Arnold film. She just knows how to get the most out of all of her cast, especially the unknown actors like the lead of this film, Kaikia Adams. Haven't really heard of her because she's never really done anything before, because this is literally the only film she has ever done, but she is the lead, Bailey, in this film. But the way Arnold directs her, you would think this girl has done at least 4 or 5 movies before this, which is absolutely insane, and Andrea Arnold consistently does this. Like, you'll never find a bad performance in one of her movies. Like, for example, there is this shitty boyfriend of Bailey's mom in the movie that doesn't have a lot of screen time. He barely has any scenes. But when he does show up, you watch this guy and you're like, holy shit, this guy is really good at acting. And that takes a really talented director to get the most out of every single person on screen, because there are actors in this movie like Barry who are clearly a lot more famous and a lot more known than the rest of the cast. But I love that she gives these types
types of actors enough room to kind of do a role that feels kind of unfamiliar to a lot of the recent stuff they've been doing. Like she does with Barry here, what she kind of did with Michael Fassbender in Fish Tank, where you have these two very famous actors that are kind of doing a lot of specific roles at the time, and she gives them the flexibility to do something completely different. And those two characters, what Barry does here and Fassbender does in Fish Tank, are very different protagonists. Well, not even protagonists, just two very different characters. And like I mentioned with Barry when we were talking about Bring Them Down, this is a guy that has been cast as the Joker. He dated Sabrina Carpenter. He was in one of the biggest music videos of the year. He's at the point in his career where he could start cashing out and start making just a shit ton of money. He was originally part of Gladiator 2, and then he left the project to do stuff like Bird. And I really respect an actor that does that, because I know how tempting it could be when you have people to support and you have to get those bigger paychecks. But to see this guy doing projects on this level is something that really makes me appreciate him as not only an artist, but a person. And at first, going into the movie, I thought he was going to have a much larger role than he actually does. He's kind of like the third, maybe, main character in this movie, and he gives enough room to let the other actors on screen with him kind of breathe. Like, he never really feels like he's stealing the show from any of them. He's just really good at the character he is supposed to be playing. Another Andrea Arnold staple is she is really a master at using diegetic music in her films, and she has a needle drop here that is Coldplay related that absolutely worked. At first, I thought it might be a bit cheesy, but by the time that scene ended, I was like, damn, that does hit pretty damn good. It's one of my favorite needle drops of the entire year. But again, Andrea Arnold, even though she does everything consistently, like the things I love about her movies, I have always loved about her movies. And the things that hold her movies back from me loving the movies is the same thing that holds me back from loving Bird. And those two things, once again, are there are certain moments in the plot where things get a little bit too goofy within the context of the movie, and then there's just the overall pacing of the story. But I want to talk about that switch up first, because a lot of times when I watch an Andrea Arnold film, it makes me feel like I'm watching a more raw, Richard Linklater prime movie, something like a Slacker or a Before trilogy movie or Dazed and Confused, but you make it grittier, you put it in the UK, but then all of a sudden the most ridiculous thing ever happens, and then you're like, okay, we didn't have to do that. And Bird definitely has the biggest swing when it comes to those moments in her filmography. And in her defense, I think the switch up in Bird is the one that benefits the story the most of those three movies that I'm talking about. And it's definitely the most literal version of a switch up in terms of environment of the movie. But at the same time, emotionally, it just didn't land with me as well as I think it landed with a lot of other people. The film also has a 2-hour runtime, and I just know that there is an almost perfect 95-minute movie in here that just stretches out way too long. And again, I really am, in a weird way, a huge Andrea Arnold fan. There's just some things about her filmmaking that hold her back. Like, I think she's consistently giving, for me, a B to B minus piece of work. I could see why someone puts her in that an A plus ranking right now, and maybe I'll get there at some point. But I feel like Andrea Arnold, if she changes those two things, you know, if the movie is perfectly paced and it doesn't do anything too goofy with a character or the story itself, I think she has potential to be one of the best filmmakers working today. And a lot of people consider her to be that already. I just would say, in terms of my personal favorites, she's like so close and should be on that list for me. It's just those two things consistently hold her movies back. I think that's why I like Wasp so much, because it doesn't have time to do something too goofy with the story. It keeps itself grounded, and it's super short. And I do think if this seems like an interesting film to you, you should give her filmography a shot. She is clearly very talented. She deserves to be making movies a lot sooner than 8-year gaps between American Honey and this. I want to see a lot more work from her, and I will continue to keep her on my list of directors to always keep an eye out for, because this was one of my most anticipated of the entire festival, because her name was attached, and I do get excited to see her work, because even though she has never made a movie that will make my top 10 movies of that year list, she's just a tighter script away and less goofy scenes away from seriously being one of my favorite working filmmakers in Hollywood right now. Not even Hollywood, just independent work. And in terms of filmmaking, she is one of the best out there if she makes those changes for me. Then we have Saturday Night, which has had one of the most interesting hype trains when it comes to movies that I saw in a packed theater at TIFF. And when I say packed, I mean this was one of the hottest tickets to get while I was in Toronto. A lot of people were talking about Saturday Night over there because there was a lot of hype coming out of Telluride. There was a lot of hype around the main cast, and there was a lot of hype about the premise of the movie, since this is giving us a rundown of everything that happened right before the first ever episode of Saturday Night Live. And just to be upfront, I have never been an SNL guy. It's just never really been my thing. I never really watched it growing up, and the clips I've seen of the modern cast are some of the least funny things I have ever seen, and I've never sat through a full episode. So coming from that perspective, I was really curious to see how somebody that has that kind of relationship with SNL would feel about the entire movie. And I was also really curious about Jason Reitman, who I know a lot of people shit on. I haven't seen a lot of his movies. The only things I've actually seen from him are this and Juno, surprisingly. And I really like Juno. And you know what? For the most part, I liked Saturday Night. I think the cast is a little too stacked for me to talk about everyone because this is already such a long TIFF recap video. But we're talking about Gabriel LaBelle, Cooper Hoffman, Dylan O'Brien, Rachel Sennett, Willem Dafoe, J.K. Simmons are just a few of the people. And even though not all of them have a lot of screen time, it never feels like any of them are really phoning it in at any point, which I really did appreciate. People are really praising Gabriel LaBelle a lot. I want him to take on something a bit more challenging than this. I thought he was kind of just playing Sammy Fableman again. And I really like him in the Fablemans. I really do. I just want to see a bit more of what he's got before I call him one of the better actors working today. Because to me, the standout of this movie was by far Corey Michael Smith as Chevy Chase. And it looks like he's been in a few things I've seen already, like May December, First Man, Carol, and Wonderstruck, but I don't remember him in any of those movies. And he is so good as Chevy Chase that at first I thought they were using some sort of deep fake technology, like the de-aging stuff they used for The Irishman or for the Star Wars stuff on Disney Plus. Like he just looked so identical. And not only does he look like Chevy Chase, he sounds like him too. It was like almost a one-for-one person, and he was by far the funniest part of the movie. He was by far my favorite part of the movie, and the reason I want to see Saturday Night again is because of his performance. I also think this is one of the most well-paced movies of the entire year. Like, I think it clocks in just under an hour and 40 minutes, but it flew by. By the time the credits rolled, I thought I'd only sat through an hour of it. Like, the credits roll and you think you have like 30 more minutes to go. And I don't even really mean that in a bad way, like I was unsatisfied with where it ended. I just couldn't believe that there wasn't another 30 minutes left on the entire runtime. I also think, aesthetically speaking, Saturday Night looks great. Everything from the cinematography to the costume, makeup, and production design, all of it just looks incredible. And it never really felt like they were trying to do a modern retelling of what the 70s looked and felt like. It actually felt like something where we were there with the characters and they just happened to put a modern camera there. That being said, it's definitely one of those movies that I kept going back and forth between a 3 and a 3.5 on. I, for a little bit, had it at a 3, then I went up to a 3.5, and the more time passes, I do think I would bring it back down to a 3. And like I probably mentioned already, when I do that on Letterboxd, if I'm between a 3 and a 3.5, I usually end up just rounding down to really let the ones that really stand out. Like, if it really was a 3.5 for me, it'd probably be a 3.5. So that's why I bring it down to a 3. So I wouldn't say it's an absolute, like, you have to see this movie, but I do think if you and some friends are trying to find something fun to watch, this is very easy to throw on. There's a lot of good laughs. It's super accessible. Anybody could watch this and enjoy it. It won't make you think that hard. You probably won't think about it a year from now, but you'll definitely be entertained. And I think that's worth the price of admission alone. I also got to see The Order, which is the new thriller from director Justin Kurzel, who made the Macbeth movie, which I have not seen, along with the Assassin's Creed movie, which I have seen and really hated. But this film is based on a true story, and it stars Jude Law as this FBI agent who starts investigating this white supremacist terrorist group. And the leader of that terrorist group is played by Nicholas Hoult, who is continuously proving to be one of the most versatile actors working in Hollywood right now. And I'm sure he will be a household name after he plays Lex Luthor in the new Superman movie, but the guy is just super talented. But regardless, I went into The Order pretty optimistic about what I was going to get because a lot of people at TIFF had seen it before me, and I was hearing some overall pretty good things about it. And when you're seeing almost 40 movies at a film festival, I'm a sucker for every kind of movie, trust me, but every once in a while, out of those 40, you need something where you're like, hey, I just need a good thriller. I need need something fun. Let's go. You need that at least once every other day, I feel like, to get some sort of adrenaline rush to be like, oh yeah, like let's keep it going. It's like a shot of espresso. You just need to see something like that. And in terms of that kind of movie, I think The Order is pretty solid. I think Jude Law and Nicholas Hoult are two of the main reasons that I did enjoy it as much as I did, because for a movie like this, you always need to buy into the two leads, especially on the villain side. And I do think Jude Law is pretty solid here. I mean, he's Jude Law. He's always good. But Nicholas Hoult, man, I wouldn't even say he's like amazing or anything in this movie. He's definitely really, really good, but he's just always depicting his characters perfectly. Like, you see him in this, Mad Max Fury Road, and The Menu, and he's playing three completely different characters, but you buy him 100% in all three of them. And then you have Ty Sheridan, who I can never buy in anything. He's fine in this movie, but every time I'm like, man, what the hell happened to Ty Sheridan? He shows up in a movie and I'm like, oh yeah, he's not the greatest actor that we have. There are a few pretty fun set pieces here, like the highlight of the movie for me was some sort of sequence that happens on a highway without spoiling anything, but I thought it was pretty damn awesome. But there's no scene in this movie where I'm like, oh man, that was like one of the best sequences of the year. All of it's just pretty solid. My friend Amanda saw it before I did, and she was ranting about how nobody in this movie could get a clean shot with their gun and everyone just misses horribly. And those are the types of things that I feel like for the most part I could always ignore in a movie. Like, unless it's egregious, I won't always point out. I'm not going to nitpick things. But in The Order, it is egregious at some of these scenes. There is one sequence in particular where there is some character chasing another character, and the character shooting is missing so bad he's hitting a window in a car that's like 5 or 6 whole feet away, and you're like, bro, how are you a cop? So stuff like that is definitely a little goofy, but just like how we were talking about Relay earlier, there are certain movies that are perfect for your dad who, if he was flipping channels on cable back in the day, this would be the movie where he stops, watches the whole thing, and has a good time. I know I've said the word solid more times in this segment of the whole TIFF recap than any other section of the video, but I really do think The Order is one of those movies. It's a good time. It gives me nothing else to really think or talk about, but I promise you, if you watch it, you will think it's solid. You could watch it with your dad, your uncle, your friends. You'll all probably have a good time, but you're not going to think about this movie a year from now, just like with Saturday Night, for example. I don't really see it making a lot of people's top 10 best movies of the year list, but it's definitely not going to make anybody's top 10 worst movies of the year list either. So that's where I'm at with this. So depending on how much extra time you have during this holiday season, and if you're looking to go to the theater and just spend some fun time there, I'd say it's worth a shot. But if you're in a holiday season where you're super stressed out, you have a lot of stuff to catch up on, too many things to do, this is one I don't think you have to prioritize before 2025 starts. I think your top 10 2024 list is going to be just fine without this movie. Unstoppable is the true story of Anthony Robles, who went viral a few years ago because he went to the NCAA championship for wrestling, even though the guy was born with one leg. And I did not know anything about this story going in, really, which is crazy because my dad is a huge fan of just real wrestling. And maybe I vaguely remember this happening like 10 years ago on Facebook. I'm sure I saw a clip of this when it went down, but I really knew nothing about the story. Going into TIFF, I didn't even realize that's what the movie was about. I thought it was a boxing movie this whole time starring Jarrell Jerome, but my friend Zach from Intercut saw it first and he was like, no, it's about this guy that did this wrestling thing and blah, 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 blah. And I was excited because I really do like Jarrell Jerome. If you don't know, he was the guy in Moonlight. He was in that show When They See Us, and I really do think he's one of the most talented young men working in Hollywood right now. The guy is no joke. I've had him on my radar for quite a few years, and he might not be a household name yet, but I really do think over the next few decades, he has a lot of potential of doing that. And his portrayal of Anthony Robles is no different, because this is one of those movies where I do feel like you probably could have cast an unknown actor, right? You probably could have gone that route, but anything Jarrell Jerome is in, he just elevates the entire project, and Unstoppable is no exception to that. It's directed by William Goldenberg, who hasn't directed anything before, but he did win an Oscar for editing Argo, and he's done a lot of Hollywood editing for decades in films like Heat, Air, National Treasure, a few of the Transformers movies. So the guy clearly has filmmaking experience for sure, a lot more than me. And I would say he does a decent job directing an incredible true story. Like, in a way, I think you could argue the newness of being a director is the thing holding back Unstoppable from being one of the best sports movies of the past few years. But earlier in the TIFF recap, I talked about how Rachel Morrison also had a directional debut at TIFF with a sports movie. And if you watch this and The Fire Inside back to back, which are both Amazon movies coming out in December, ironically, you could just tell that The Fire Inside is just a way better movie. It feels like Rachel has made 4 or 5 or 6 movies before that one, versus Unstoppable definitely feels like a directional debut. But with all that being said, I do think Unstoppable gives you a lot of enjoyable things, and there are a lot of solid performances in the movie. Like I mentioned multiple times already, I don't have to be sold on Jarrell Jerome. He's always good, and Unstoppable is no exception. J-Lo is also pretty good here. You could tell she's trying really hard to get an Oscar nomination, and I wouldn't give it to her. I think she probably just misses it, but she is pretty damn good in the movie, along with Bobby Carnival, who is always playing Bobby Carnival, but he plays the stepdad here. In my TIFF group, I saw this last out of everybody, and a lot of people were making the joke. My friend Johnny kept saying choices, because that's all this fucking guy says in the movie. He says choices more than anything else in any movie of the past 2 years. But even though he just says choices all the fucking time, he's undeniably good at being himself in these movies. Like, he's the shitty stepdad, he's playing Bobby Carnival, but he plays Bobby Carnival better than anybody else can. I also think the wrestling sequences are very impressive here. If there's one thing that Goldenberg does really good, it's directing those moments. Because you would think since Jarrell is supposed to only have one leg, they would do a lot of kind of zoom-ins and really quick shots of the wrestling so you can kind of work around the one leg situation. But there are entire sequences where they shoot it wide for a long time and you could clearly see he's wrestling with one leg. And I found out much later that Robles himself is the stunt double, so I'm sure they use that for a lot of sequences. But even when you could clearly tell there's one leg in the frame and Jarrell is on screen, they do an excellent job of making everything seem seamless here. And it's just one of those movies I could easily recommend to everybody. If you're sitting around at Christmas time and you have a family that has very different tastes, and, you know, like my mom, she can't handle anything too intense. She doesn't want to be too scared or watch anything too actiony. This is a movie I could throw on for her, my dad, my sister. We'd all sit there and be like, wow, that was pretty good. My mom would probably love it. It's very basic. I would still pick The Fire Inside over this. I think they go for the same exact demographic in a way, and The Fire Inside is just a way better movie. But if you're doing a double feature for Christmas this year, I would say watch both of these movies, but put The Fire Inside on first. I'll probably forget about it a year from now, but you know what? It was pretty damn good, and it almost made me shed a tear. Now let's talk about Flow, which a lot of people consider to be the best animated film of the entire year. I got to attend a screening with a Q&A with director. I'm going to look at the screen because I'm going to butcher the pronunciation anyway. I'll even pull out the glasses for this one. We got Glintz Zilbalotis. I am sorry, I definitely butchered the name, Glintz, but man, you are a talented person. He is a Latvian filmmaker who has been doing a lot of solo projects for a while now, but Flow is the first thing I've seen from him. I mean, my man Will, shout out to you, Will. This is one of his most anticipated movies of the entire year. He said I had to see this at TIFF. I was already planning on seeing this at TIFF, but I specifically fit it in my schedule because I knew Will was probably interested in this movie. So shout out to you, Will. You are the man. And Will has really good taste, so I trusted his opinion on the director's other work. I went into this pretty blind, not knowing what to expect. And overall, just to spoil my thoughts, I think Flow is pretty damn good. If you don't know already, this entire movie has absolutely zero dialogue because you are watching a cat try and survive in this world where some sort of natural disaster has happened. I'm not going to get too into it because you learn little things about the movie, but that's pretty much the basic premise of the movie and what you get the entire time. And along the way, he meets a bunch of different types of animals that are all developed into real characters through their actions throughout the entire journey. And trust me, this never turns into Madagascar where the animals just take a magic potion and they start talking and it's like fucking Chris Rock voicing the cat. This is not that kind of movie. And the storytelling here is so good that you get invested in these characters pretty easily. Like, it got to the point early on where I knew pretty much everyone in my theater was locked in, especially the old lady in front of me, because there's a part where a certain animal is in danger and she was like this the entire sequence. Like, she really thought one of these animals was going to die, and I was hoping the animal wouldn't die because this woman would die right in front of me. She was so locked into this movie. And you have to give a lot of credit to the director Glintz and his entire team. Like, he said this was the first time he worked with a team, and that kind of inspired the story because their visual storytelling capabilities are pretty much unparalleled to anyone else I've seen working in recent memory, because not only are they great at developing these characters through their actions, but the entire direction of certain sequences is absolutely incredible. There are whole segments of this movie where the digital camera doesn't cut for like 5 to 10 minutes, I want to say, and those sequences are so well crafted, they're so well thought out, they're so action-packed, And that is not the easiest thing to pull off, especially when a movie is this low budget and you're only working with a few animators. The director himself is even responsible for making the score of the movie, because when I was watching it, I was like, damn, the music is so good in here. And then someone at the Q&A asked, like, who's the composer? They did such a great job and we want to learn more about the composing side of the film. And the guy, like, not even with an ego, was just like, well, thank you. Like, I made the score. And people started clapping, obviously, because you're like, what the fuck? You did the story, you did the animation, you did the music. This guy is just too talented. And I'm very excited to see what he does next, because for me, Flow is still like a 3 out of 5 movie. Like, it's solid. I wouldn't really watch it again. The animation style isn't really my personal favorite, but I can still appreciate that Flow is the best version of this indie video game looking movie. I know we're kind of on this streak right now, but it's not one of my personal favorites of the entire year, but it is one of those movies I could easily recommend to anybody. I can't really see anybody disliking it. I can see a lot of people putting it on their top 10 movies of 2024 list. So if this is something that seems like it'll be up your alley, you're probably going to end up loving it. And it's one of those movies where even if I don't really love it, I absolutely respect the hell out of it. And I am really interested in seeing what the director Glintz ends up doing next. I got to see the new Tim Robinson and Paul Rudd comedy this year in Toronto called Friendship, which was recently picked up by A24. And without giving away any of the jokes or the skits, it's pretty much about these two guys that are newly acquainted neighbors that start a friendship. And then if you know anything about Tim Robinson's comedy style, some weird stuff starts happening. I was skeptical going into this because my friend Jake has been trying to get me into I Think You Should Leave for years now. And the few clips I've seen from that show, I just wasn't laughing as much as he was. It just never really clicked with me. So when they announced this movie was coming to TIFF, I know a lot of people were super excited about it and it was like a must watch for them. For me, it was kind of like if I could get to it, awesome. If not, I'm not really going to prioritize it while I'm there. But as soon as we got there, everybody that saw the movie loved it. They were all saying it's one of the funniest movies of the past few years. So as soon as I started hearing all the hype, I knew I had to try and secure a ticket for Friendship. And luckily I did. I found a ticket kind of last minute for the last screening possible. And I think I got the ideal viewing experience for this because I sat next to two guys who clearly lived in Toronto, have been buddies for years, and were only at this movie theater. They didn't fly out to TIFF to see all these critically acclaimed movies. They came on a Saturday or whatever it was to come see Friendship. And you could tell they were Tim Robinson fans because every time the camera just stayed on his face like 3 or 4 seconds before the punchline was even said, they were already cracking up, which was making me laugh. And it really made me appreciate this movie a lot more. I think that's the kind of viewing experience. Everybody should go and see this in a theater with as many funny people as possible. And again, coming from somebody that never really got into Tim Robinson's other work and never really found the appeal to him, I think Friendship is really damn good. I think it's really funny. Because these days, a lot of the funniest movies of the year are like independent dramas that have comedy in them. Like I've already said, I loved Anora at the film festival this year. It's one of my favorite movies of the year for sure. And Anora is very funny. I think Anora in a lot of ways leans more comedy than drama. But at the end of the day, like Anora will make you feel something at the end. And I'm not even saying that as a bad thing to Friendship. I'm just saying the only reason Friendship is being made is to make the audience laugh. There is nothing that's going to make you think deeper here. There's no like little message at the end. It's just flat out hilarious the entire time. And I think the world needs movies like that right now because comedy has gotten bigger in the sense that all these big comedians have huge podcasts now. I mean, stand-up comedy has become a lot more popular in recent years because of stuff like Instagram Reels. So people are dying for really funny stuff. They're just not really getting it in movies these days. And sometimes when I'm on film Twitter, I'm just sick of people being like, oh, you want to see a funny movie this weekend? Go see Problemista. And I really like Problemista. Don't get me wrong. That's like a top 20, top 25 movie of the year for me. And it has good jokes, but it's not meant to be a straight up comedy. All these movies that have funny things in them are always going for something deeper, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think there should be enough room for all movies to have some sort of comedy. I'm saying we have had such a noticeable lack of just straight up funny, ridiculous movies. So we either get indie comedies or we get Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk making a joke about, oh, we're just like the Beatles. And then like everybody in the theater erupts and you're sitting there like, what the fuck has humanity come to? And Friendship just feels like a great answer to that problem I have had with the industry for almost a decade at this point, because it is genuinely really funny. And it made me go back to watch some of I Think You Should Leave. I watched a little bit of the first season and there were definitely skits in there that I found funnier this time around, now that I understand his specific humor a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I still think that Friendship is the funniest I have seen of Tim Robinson. Maybe that statement changes when I see later seasons of that show, or I think he's working on another Netflix show right now. But regardless, I think he's hilarious in this, and it makes me more excited to see what other movies he has up his sleeve in the future. And I don't want to spend too much time on the movie in this specific TIFF recap, because I think part of the fun is going in, not knowing any of the bits, you know, and just kind of experiencing it for yourself. Because there's a lot of quotes I could say right now that crack me up, but I'm not going to ruin that for you. I want you to experience that for yourself. Maybe I'll make a longer video on Friendship when it actually comes out. It's going to release sometime in 2025. It is A24. I hope they don't do like a limited release for this one. I feel like Tim Robinson is big enough where you could put him in a good amount of theaters, especially with Paul Rudd right next to him on the cover. If you nail the trailer for this, I do think it could be a pretty good hit for A24, and it's one of the funniest movies of the past few years. And when it comes out, I can't wait to see it again. I'm going to take my girlfriend, my friends. Maybe not everybody will connect with the comedy. I can understand someone walking out and being like, yeah, Tim Robinson's just still not for me. But as someone that was in that seat just a few months ago at this point, he really made a fan out of me with this movie. I also got to see Dead Mail, which is a super low budget horror / thriller movie. It played in the Midnight Madness section this year. I didn't go to the Midnight Madness screening. I saw a later screening in the festival, and it follows this musician who is being held hostage by this psychopath played by John Fleck. But things go a bit wrong when a bloody letter shows up at the dead letter part of the local post office, and this guy starts to investigate what the hell could be behind this bloody letter. And I hate to say this, but this is one of those movies, I saw it, the time passed, and I haven't really thought about it since. And it's not even like that bad of a movie. I think for the budget that the two directors have to work with, it is impressive. Like, I do enjoy a low-budget horror / thriller movie every once in a while. I like supporting up-and-coming filmmakers, and I do think they do a good enough job with the material that they started out with. I think you could tell John Fleck has a great time in this movie. He's by far my favorite part of it. He's having fun the entire time. The character is really interesting, and the directors clearly have a vision that they accomplish. I just think these are two guys that maybe 2 more movies down the line will make an absolutely great movie, especially when they have a lot more money to work with. There's a few good laughs in here. There's some tension that is definitely well-deserved, but at the end of the day, I just kind of forgotten about Dead Mail. I have zero desire to ever rewatch it again. I'm probably going to forget about it a month from now, but it's not something I'm going to waste my time talking about if I'm having trouble recalling a lot of those moments from the movie. It's nice for what it is. A horror movie that has not left my memory since I saw it was It Doesn't Get Any Better Than This, which is another Midnight Madness movie that premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival this year. I did not go to the midnight screening. I went to a screening that happened 2 or 3 days later around like 7 or 8 p.m. And if you don't already know, there has been a lot of hype built up around this movie, especially when the trailer dropped, because the entire driving force of the marketing behind the movie is that you can only ever see this movie in theaters. The filmmakers are going to tour it around the country, and you can't see it unless you go to the local screening that might happen in a town near you. They refuse to release it digitally online ever. They say they kind of want to tour this for as long as they can, which is something that will definitely get people talking. Now, the screening I went to did not have a Q&A, but I had a couple friends that went to the midnight screening of this, and the filmmakers came out and pretty much made everybody in the theater do breathing exercises before the movie started, because they were really saying, like, we know this is an intense movie. We know it's going to freak a lot of you out. We're going to do some exercises to help calm you down. And that is the tone that they set for this movie. And I might have messed up. I said this premiered at Toronto. It did not premiere at Toronto. I believe there were a couple screenings before. I could be wrong on that. But somebody had told me they knew people that saw the movie and loved it. Like, they were saying, this lives up to the hype. You have to see this while you're at TIFF. So I told a couple of my friends about that. They went to screenings before me. I saw it last out of everybody I knew. And even though I didn't hear necessarily the best things from certain people after they actually saw it at the festival, I was like, you know what? They're setting the bar high. They're saying this is really scary. They are saying this is the new Blair Witch Project-esque movie. Let's see what happens. And man, even though I hated Megalopolis more than any movie I saw in Toronto, the entire festival, I didn't really hate any movies. As you can tell from this whole recap, I liked and loved a lot of movies, but I fucking despised Megalopolis, and I hated it. Doesn't get any better than this. This is an unbelievable scam of marketing. And you know what? When you act this obnoxious about your own movie, having people do fucking breathing exercises before it starts, I don't care. I'm gonna rip into you because this is bullshit. I respect the hustle. It's hard to get people interested in any movie, regardless of the budget. So to come up with an idea of we're gonna tour this movie around the country and you can only see it in theaters, that's a genius marketing ploy. Congratulations. But if you are selling the audience on that specific thing, you have to deliver on it. Otherwise, people like me are going to tell those people, don't waste your fucking money on this movie. Because apparently you could only ever see it in theaters. But come on, we all know it's bullshit. We all know it's going to drop digitally sometime in the next 2 years. But even if you're not going off of that gimmick, if you are hyping this up like how they hyped up Longlegs, where this movie is so scary you need to breathe in and breathe out before you watch it, then your movie has to live up to that kind of quality. And say what you want about the Terrifier franchise, for example. Like, yeah, they are super fucked up, and that is the gimmick of those movies, and it's definitely not for everybody. It's not even really my thing, but each of those 3 movies in that trilogy delivers on the gimmick that the audience bought a ticket for. Like, people that went to Terrifier knew how fucked up it was going to be, and that's why they bought the ticket, because they wanted to see how fucked up it gets. And when you're saying your movie is this scary and you walk in, and not only is it one of the least scary movies I have seen in the past few years, not only is it one of the biggest chores I've had to sit through in the past 10 years, but besides Megalopolis, this is probably the most annoying movie of the 2020s so far. And it starts with the filmmakers who cast themselves as the main trio of actors in this movie, which is always a great idea when you're an atrocious actor. And I know that sounds harsh and mean, and you could tell these are probably 3 people that were bullied in high school for making weird short films, and I get it, you know, I made weird shit in high school, people made fun of me for that for sure. But the difference is, I don't put it in movie theaters, have people buy a ticket for it, and then all of a sudden I'm like, all right guys, we gotta breathe in and breathe out before we watch it. And maybe I should have done that. Maybe I should have been like, all right guys, we're gonna watch my short film Isolation from freshman year of college. It's gonna be super bad, so breathe in, breathe out. It's just fucking obnoxious. And it starts with the script, which I feel like doesn't even exist, because there are whole segments of this movie where it literally feels like they are putting together the short films they made in high school to help tell the past story of these 3 characters. But when you watch them, they have nothing to do with the plot of the movie. So it's like you're being forced to watch one of their old 1-minute short films for no reason. And whenever they're shooting new footage for the movie, one of them has like a different horror movie shirt, or there's a different horror movie poster in the background. Can you be any less original? And the woman in this movie, Rachel, she's the director, one of the directors. She is one of the leads of this movie. She has a cackle that I am not even going to imitate because I am not going to embarrass myself on camera. But the whole movie is like 6 minutes of nothing and then 5 minutes of them in a basement of one of their mom's houses. And they're like, what if the house is haunted? I mean, no, there's no way the house could be haunted. But that is what the entire movie sounds like when they're talking to each other. It's just so annoying, and they just feel like losers making a movie. And the worst part is the audio is the worst sound mixing I have ever heard in a theater. So anytime she cackles, you think your eardrum's gonna pop out of your body. And it's not even just the cackle. It's just there are literally certain segments of the movie where they just blast obnoxious ghost sounds as loud as they can. And yeah, I needed to do breathing exercises too while doing this because I thought I was gonna lose my mind. And when I tell you there are sequences where nothing happens for like 5 or 6 minutes, I mean they go up in the attic and try to talk to a ghost at some point. And when I tell you 2 of these bums are sitting there trying to channel the ghost for like 5.5 minutes. It's ridiculous. And then there's another sequence where they're like, oh, I wonder who that is. I wonder where we should follow them to. I wonder where they're gonna go. So we follow this random girl for another 5.5, 6 minutes. It might have been 8. It felt long. And of course, after 5 or 6 minutes, she goes nowhere interesting. There is no payoff for anything in this movie. This thing is barely a feature at 84 minutes. So when you notice there are multiple sequences, whether it be stringing together old short films, or having the camera sit in the attic for 5 minutes, or walking behind somebody for 6 minutes, you start to wonder, maybe this could have been a decent short film. And they probably just dragged it out so they could sell it, so they could bring it to a movie theater and you could be like, hey, we got a full movie. Come pay full price to see this very exclusive, scary movie. And as much as I'm hating on this, I do think genuinely, if there was a 10-minute short in this, it could have been a very viral thing that was actually kind of decent. You can hide a lot of the ideas that you don't have, because the basis of certain things, of like the people standing outside in a creepy way, or there's this wall where these like shadow men looking things are standing behind, like those things are genuinely creepy looking. So if you compacted that into a 5 to 15 minute short, it would have been good enough. I probably wouldn't be complaining. But when you only have 15 minutes worth of good stuff and you fill the other 70 with the most annoying bullshit in Hollywood independent filmmaking history, I mean, it's ridiculous. These people are so full of shit, it's actually insulting to anybody that has any sort of disposable income. They're also so incompetent, they uploaded the wrong version of the movie. I went to a public screening, okay? So I went to the last possible screening at Toronto for this, but some of my friends went to the press screening where they're like, the movie's really not that great. And then they got an email like the same day or the day after pretty much saying, oh, by the way, that wasn't the actual version of the movie. That wasn't our final cut. We uploaded the wrong version. Please come back and see it again. But everybody I know that saw the movie wasn't going to go see that again. I mean, at a film festival, when you have such little time and there's so many movies to watch, we're not going to watch your bad movie a second time. All I know is when I saw it, they didn't say they uploaded the wrong cut of the movie, and I was not happy. And I talked to Zach, Caitlin, and Tyler, who saw the movie before me, and we were trying to figure out, like, was there any real difference between them? And none of us got to watch them both side by side, so I can't answer that for sure. All I know is we would ask each other, oh, was this super annoying fucking thing in your version too? And we all said yes. So I don't know what's different. Who knows? Maybe they're touring this movie so they could get as many notes as possible, reshoot the entire thing as they go, and then release it digitally so it feels a bit better. But I just don't know what the plan is. If they come to a city near you, save your money. This is the biggest con job of the decade so far. And if you're one of those people giving it 5 stars on Letterboxd, either delete your alt account or let me smoke some of that crack that you got. Timo Koyantu, who I might have pronounced that right, I try to do research. If I pronounced it wrong, I am sorry, is the name of the director for Netflix's new film, The Shadow Strays, which I got to catch at Toronto in a movie theater for Midnight Madness. And this has gone severely under the radar for a lot of people out there. So I'm making it my personal duty to promote the coolest action movie of potentially the year and also the decade. Because when it comes to action filmmaking, you have your different types, right? Like I do think Furiosa is probably the better movie in terms of these two, but that one focuses on action like the one on the highway, where it's a 15-minute sequence and there's all these cars and stuff like that. But when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, this is the best action I've seen in a movie since The Raid. And when it comes to the director Timo, I am severely behind on all of his work. Before this, I only saw some of his stuff in the VHS movies, which I don't even know which segments were his, but I've heard amazing things about The Night Comes for Us, and I just haven't seen it yet. I hear great things. I gotta watch it, and I bet it is as good as everyone says, because the way he directs every sequence here, you could just tell this guy has the talent. Marvel still hasn't figured out their Blade situation, and if they actually wanted to give a director full creative control and not make something that felt like it came out of a factory, just give this guy the steering wheel. The way he directs bloody hand-to-hand combat is something that should be studied in film school. Because look, the John Wick franchise has rightfully gotten a ton of praise over the past 10 years because they really have set the precedent for American action movies and their whole gung fu. Is that what they call it? The gun fu fighting style. And I really think that's awesome. John Wick deserves to be in that title of best action franchise right now. But The Shadow Strays has a lot of scenes that puts a lot of John Wick sequences to shame. From the opening sequence of this movie, I was sitting there like, I wasn't really expecting a lot because I didn't look into his filmography all that much beforehand. I was just wanting a pretty fun movie with a midnight crowd. And the second the first scene happened, I was like, holy shit, that might be the best action scene of the decade so far. And then every scene that comes after just gets better and better and better, at least in terms of the action sequences. And maybe there's a point, right? Like if the first one starts here and you're like, damn, that was awesome. The second one, damn, that was awesome. Third, damn, that was awesome. Fourth, damn, that was awesome. Maybe the fifth one's like, oh yeah, that one's really good. And the sixth one's like, damn, that was awesome. So maybe it's not like a perfect trajectory of always necessarily improving the last sequence, but man, it just doesn't stop the second the movie begins. So I don't know what the hell is going on over in Indonesia, but all I know is those people are making the best action stuff. Whenever they decide to make an action movie, it is awesome. Between this and The Raid, I mean, over the past 15 years, they are putting the rest of the world to shame. And look, the movie is pretty long. It's 2.5 hours, and when I saw it, it was the last Midnight Madness screening of Toronto, where I was there the entire time for the film festival, so I was exhausted. This thing started at 11:30, not midnight. Part of me thought about skipping it because I was so exhausted by that point, but I was like, you know what? No, I want to see this movie. I hope it's fun. The least optimal way to see this movie in terms of energy, I was at that level. And not only did this movie keep me awake, not only did this movie keep me entertained, but this entire thing flew by. 2.5 hours felt closer to 2 hours for me personally, and I wish everybody got the chance to see this movie in a movie theater with a packed crowd. That was one of the most fun experiences I've had all year in a theater. Everybody in there had a great time whenever something bloody and crazy would happen. It's like everyone's talking about how fun Gladiator 2 is recently. And you watch a movie like this and you're like, how could you have fun with Gladiator 2? Because there's just so many other people out there that are so much more talented, giving you something that's super creative and super crazy besides sharks in the Coliseum. And I don't want to spoil any of the sequences for you. I do want you to go in as blind as you can and just experience the action scenes as they happen. But if anybody watches this and goes, yeah, you know what, the action was okay, they're full of shit. I will say the areas where the film falls a bit flat for me is in terms of the story, because it's very basic. It's an assassin that goes against her order. She tries to protect a younger boy. You've seen that story a million times, and it's not bad or anything. It's just super basic. They try to add some emotion to the story that I really think doesn't work at all. Like, I never really felt the chemistry between the two lead actresses of mentor and mentee. Like, I just didn't really fully buy into that. So I think if there is one thing, John Wick definitely wins in terms of action franchise filmmaking, because it seems like they're gonna make Shadow Strays too, and I can't wait for that. But the John Wick franchise definitely does a better job at world building. You know, even though the action is pretty neck and neck of who's better, I probably think the Shadow Strays has the better action overall. But in terms of the world building and how they set up John Wick and how they hype him up of, oh man, you killed John Wick's dog? What the hell were you thinking? You know, they really add a lot of things to that entire world, and it builds the universe in a really compelling way that I don't think the Shadow Strays does necessarily. Because in here you're like, oh, okay, they're assassins. They're the coolest assassins fighting ever, but they're just assassins. But again, it's probably the best hand-to-hand combat you'll see in the entire decade so far. It is on Netflix right now. Watch it with a friend that loves action movies. You'll both have a great time. Because look, this kind of movie is not even really my favorite kind of movie. Like, a lot of this kind of stuff I tend to gloss over, but when there's this much passion in front of and behind the camera, I mean, it deserves as big of a shout out as I could possibly give it. Now I want to talk about Emilia Perez, which has become the most controversial movie of the entire year. Because if you don't know, the story follows a cartel leader who gets the help of a lawyer to help her transition into a woman, and then she fakes her death to help protect herself and her family, but then she still wants to be involved in her family, so she comes back a couple years later and pretends like she's this long-lost aunt that nobody in the family knew. And look, this movie gets messy. It gets messy in terms of structure, it gets messy in terms of story, and on top of all of that messiness, it's a musical, and not really an English musical either. This is full on, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure all of the songs in Spanish. If anything, maybe Selena Gomez sings a little bit in English, but for the most part, this is a full-on Spanish-speaking musical. Netflix put a lot of money into it. You could tell in terms of all of the filmmaking aspects, like everything from the cinematography, lighting, just the entire, every musical sequence I thought looked great, and it's some of my favorite musical sequences of the year because we've gotten a good amount of musicals so far. And I went into this movie hearing a ton of mixed reviews about it. The people that love this movie love this movie. The people that hate this movie despise this movie. And I went to watch it because if I'm at a film festival, my main objective is to watch as many movies as possible. Clearly, with how long this video is and how many movies we talked about, I want to try and see everything. And I gotta say, I came out of that movie on definitely the positive side. Like, I didn't come out saying, oh my God, Emilia Perez is one of the best movies of the year. I wouldn't go that far, but I would be lying if I didn't think this movie was absolutely fascinating. And I do think there are criticisms that are worth criticizing the movie over, but at the same time, when we live in a world where there are so many movies that feel like they're just copy and paste from a random factory and we're never getting anything that's too original. I mean, do we get more original than Emilia Perez? This thing is so wild in so many different aspects. It's a movie that stands out for so many different reasons, and I do think it's something that is hard to forget about. Most of the performances in here are pretty amazing. Zoe Saldana has always been great. I know we don't ever talk about her in terms of like best actresses working today, just because I feel like it's kind of easy to forget about her in the sense that she's always doing something like Guardians of the Galaxy or Avatar. She's always in makeup. She's always behind CGI. But when she cries in Avatar, you feel that through your entire body and soul. And in here, she won't make you cry or anything like that, but you will watch her on screen and be like, holy shit, this is one of the best living actresses of our time. It seems like for award season, they're putting her in the supporting category, which I felt weird about coming out of this movie. I know she's supposed to be in supporting and Carla is supposed to be in the best actress. And even coming out of the movie, I was confused which would go in which. I was telling people like, yeah, I know it's called Emilia Perez, but it kind of starts off with Zoe Saldana being the lead. And then eventually, I guess she would go in supporting. So I guess they're doing Saldana in supporting. And either way, she is my pick to win. She crushes every aspect of her role here, whether she's talking or singing. I really was more blown away with her than I thought I would be. And yeah, if she wins the Oscar, I'm gonna be really happy. And the craziest part is she might not even be the best performance of the movie because Carla Sofia Gascon is absolutely remarkable. It's the word I was looking for. This is one of my favorite performances of the year, for sure. Like, Mikey Madison is incredible. I probably would still give it to Mikey Madison. But if there is a world where this woman wins in an upset, I would be pretty happy because she is also balancing so many more things within her character that not a lot of actors get the chance to even do. Because when she first shows up on screen, she is portraying the pre-transition character. And when she is in that mode, I was like, holy shit, like this is crazy. That part alone was already one of my favorite performances of the year. And then the character goes through the transition and then we're seeing her life post-transition and you're like, holy shit, she's just as good. And it's one of those performances that will stick with you as soon as the credits roll. Like even though there are certain things about Emilia Perez that haven't aged as well for me over the past 2 months, her performance has remained one of my favorite things of the entire year. I think it works emotionally. I think when she's more threatening, she's also fantastic. I just think she gives one of the best performances of the year. I do think maybe I would still give it to Mikey, but I don't know. They're the two really holding out for me. And then among all of that, you have Selena Gomez, she's Selena Gomez in the movie. I don't know. I wasn't fully sold on her. Like, even the music stuff, you think someone that's a pop star would be able to really carry this a bit more. I think what I was afraid Ariana Grande would end up being for Wicked is what Selena Gomez ended up being for this movie, where Ariana Grande fit that character. She understood the assignment. Selena Gomez is just kind of there and you're like, I am not buying into you at all. They probably did cast her to get more hype around the movie to get the Selena Gomez fans interested in watching this on Netflix. But I just think when you see the other two performances and they're giving some of the best work of the decade so far, and then it cuts to Selena Gomez Gomez, you feel like you're watching two different movies. But even her musical sequence is completely striking. I think almost all of the sequences here in terms of the music really do work. There are definitely some that lyrically work a lot better than others. But even if a song isn't working lyrically, I think thematically it still looks incredible. Like, I think everyone that worked behind the camera on this movie killed it. And I was so musicaled out in this TIFF experience. There were already so many I sat through, and I was like, am I gonna have to sit through another musical? I like musicals every once in a while, but sometimes when you see like 3 or 4 or 5, it's a lot. But as soon as the first one started, I was like, holy shit, this is probably the most well choreographed musical sequence of TIFF. But even saying that out loud, Better Man has one that was flat out incredible. So I don't know where Emilia Perez ranks in terms of that, especially when you add in Wicked to the mix from this year. If you're a musical fan, you got a lot of options this year. But there are so many sequences in here I absolutely love, and I really do think if you are a musical fan, there's a lot to appreciate here. And like I said, we don't ever get too many mainstream musicals that aren't in English. And like I said, the movie is a mess, but I think there's a difference between a movie that doesn't realize it's a mess and a movie that is aware that it's a mess and it kind of just embraces it as being a mess. I think Emilia Perez definitely lands in the latter of that, especially when it comes from the director who has made some of the most critically acclaimed movies of all time at this point. I'm admittedly behind on his filmography, and I don't want to butcher his name. Jacques Audiard might have butchered it. I saw The Sisters Brothers, didn't like it. I've heard incredible things about A Prophet, like it's one of the best movies ever made, apparently. So I am behind on his work, but this doesn't strike me as a guy that doesn't really understand the movie he's making. I think he was fully aware of the mess that comes with making like this kind of story, not even in terms of like what the story's about, but in terms of there are so many different things happening, and yet he still finds a way to kind of piece it together. All those pieces don't necessarily land perfectly, but I do think he went for something very bold here, and I do appreciate that. And I think the movie gets messiest maybe towards the end. Like, I do like the actual ending of the movie, the last like 2 or 3 minutes, but I think the 15 to 20 minutes before that does feel like a little messy, a little, okay, can we start wrapping this up? Like, even though I enjoyed my time with Emilia Perez, it definitely felt pretty long by the end of it, and I was like, okay, I'm kind of ready to step out of this world now. Like, I think I've seen enough. I think that goes into, for whatever reason, there are some movies like this where I walk out and I really enjoyed that experience. I had a great time, but I don't really have a desire to revisit it. Emilia Perez is one of those 3.5-star movies where I really liked it. I really had a lot of fun with it. I really was affected by a good amount of it, but I just don't know if I would sit through it again. I would sit through certain parts of it again, no problem, but I do think it starts to feel a bit exhausting by the end of it. I can see why it would upset some trans people in the sense that they use the trans experience kind of like a plot device to help hide certain aspects of a character, and it almost makes it look like this trans person's supposed to hide, but it's also telling the story of a cartel leader, and since it is a cartel leader, they have to deal with certain things that a more regular living working class person wouldn't have to deal with. So that's one of the reasons I'm like, I understand why this would piss people off, but at the same time, I don't think the movie has any bad intentions behind it. I mean, they cast a trans woman as the lead, and that person has a lot to do with the forming of this character. I think, honestly, if you put this in the hands of a different director, it would feel a lot more insulting. And I'm not a trans person, so I can't really speak to that, but I do think maybe the film is getting a bit more critiqued than it deserves to be. I get where people are coming from, but I really think there are way more malicious movies out there, and I don't feel like Emilia Perez is one of them. This is a very specific trans story that they decide to tell, and I think people will talk about it a bit more positively a couple of years from now, and I'm excited to see every type of trans story that we can see over the next few decades or hundreds of years, however long movies exist. And maybe it's because we live in a world where, unfortunately, we don't have enough trans stories on film right now, but I get the criticism. I'm not one of those people criticizing it for that. I just think the movie gets a bit messy by the end of it. Like I said, it's weird. I really liked it. Don't feel like I have to watch it again, though. Versus some movies, when I watch them at TIFF, I like them a bit less than this, but I would be more interested in giving them a rewatch to see if I like them more. So maybe this really is a 3 out of 5 compared to a 3.5. I don't know. I still really liked it, though. And that's the thing. There's a lot of really good things in this movie. So if you're interested in seeing it, it's on Netflix now. I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, we are about to talk about the final film from the Toronto International Film Festival. I want to talk about Queer and Luca Guadagnino, which was the last film I saw at Toronto this year at the film festival. And it was definitely in my top 5 most anticipated of the film festival because Luca is a very hit or miss director for me, but when he hits, man, he hits hard. Like, the Suspiria remake is one of my favorite horror movies of the past 10 years. I really adore that movie a lot. The first time I saw Calling by Your Name, I definitely really liked it. I didn't love it until I rewatched it and I was like, holy shit, this is one of the best movies ever made. So when he hits, he makes like one of my favorite movies of all time. But when he misses, he strikes out so bad for me. I don't know how many of you saw his show, We Are Who We Are, for HBO, but for a majority of that series, I would sit there and watch it and be like, this might be the worst thing I have ever seen. It definitely saves itself by the second half of the season where I didn't completely hate it, but there were so many moments where I was like, what am I doing with my life watching this? It was so intolerable to sit through, and Luca was responsible for a lot of that. And then I saw Bones and All, which I know a lot of people really love that movie, and I'm glad that you do. I also loved Bones and All. It was one of my favorite comedies of the past 5 years. There are so many awful scenes and deliveries for me, like when Mark Rylance says something like, don't get dully with Sully, or whatever the hell he said. My sister and a few other people that were in that South Jersey theater that sat through that movie, at the end where it's supposed to be super serious, we were all cracking up. I just don't think it holds up as much as everyone thinks it might. I mean, maybe if I saw it at a film festival, I'd feel different, but Bones and All, I think, is atrocious. But regardless, Lucas started off on a good streak this year. I saw Challengers. I really like Challengers. It's not in my top 10 of the year, but it's pretty close to the top 15. You know what I mean? It's probably in that 10 to 15 range. I think it's really good for sure. And now we have Queer, an adaptation of a William S. Burroughs novella. I had to Google the difference between a novel and a novella. So if you want to know how dumb I am and you could hate me for my take on this movie because of that, feel free to comment away in the comment section. So maybe I am too dumb to appreciate everything that Queer goes for. I don't know anything about William S. Burroughs. I know he's definitely a critically acclaimed author. And while there are small things I really like and appreciate about this movie, I think it falls flat in a lot of areas. I know a lot of people have been quick to compare this to something where, like, if you took Call Me By Your Name and Suspiria and blended them, you get Queer. And even I said that in my Letterboxd review to get my point across. But I feel like if you pitched Queer as that movie to a lot of people, a lot of them, like me, would walk out feeling a little bit disappointed because the quality of those two movies is nowhere near reached on this movie. There are similarities in the sense that if you compare Queer to Call Me By Your Name, there is an older man in a relationship that is kind of taking advantage of the younger man in a very lustful kind of companionship. It's just in this one, the perspective is flipped and we're following Daniel Craig's character. And then you can compare this to Suspiria because shit gets wild at certain points. And even though there are those similarities, I do think it's a bit unfair to compare Queer to both of those movies, especially when you compare Call Me By Your Name and Queer's relationship side by side. They are just trying to achieve two very different things in terms of the story. Even if both are trying to analyze lust and kind of look at what it means to be taken advantage of in an older, younger relationship in some scenarios, Queer really dials in on that a lot more obviously, and it's really following Daniel Craig struggling with addiction, not just in terms of lust, but actual drug addiction. And no matter how I felt about this movie as a whole, I do have to say I think Daniel Craig is really, really good here. He is balancing a lot emotionally throughout the entire runtime, and even when I was never fully bought into the story they were trying to tell, I was always fully bought into watching this guy. My Letterboxd says I've seen Drew Starkey in a few films already, like American Animals, The Devil All the Time, and The Hate U Give. I don't remember him being in any of those, but I think he's also pretty good here. He isn't given as much to do as you would probably think he would be given. Like, Daniel Craig just has so much more to work with in this entire story. But at the same time, I think Starkey is still very good. And I do think he has a very promising career he could build off of, especially coming off of this. And again, it's hard to talk about the chemistry because they're not really going for a romantic kind of movie here. But I like how he didn't just try to do Call Me By Your Name again. He chose to adapt a very different kind of story. And if there's one more thing I want to compliment Queer on, I think the ending is incredible. We'll talk about the final act in a second, but I was sitting there. This was the last movie I saw at the festival, and I was like, man, I don't want my TIFF experience to end. but I want to get the hell out of this theater. And then the last 5 minutes happened, and I was genuinely surprised at how much it moved me. Even though the entire film is something I have no desire to really ever revisit in full again, that is a sequence I will study for quite a long time. I think if that was its own short film, wow. But other than that, I really didn't enjoy anything about this movie. The original cut for this was apparently over 3 hours long, which is crazy because the one I saw was 2 hours and 17 minutes, and I felt like I was sitting there for eternity. And I could hop on board with a slow movie at any point. I love slow movies as long as the payoff feels like it's worth it by the end. And again, I love the ending, but everything building up to that, there is a time where the story of Queer definitely goes in a different direction than you think it will. I wasn't fully surprised considering so many people were talking about Luca's horror filmmaking when talking about this movie, so I figured something would happen. But when he goes to that place, I just could not get on the same wave that everybody else in my theater was on. People were super into it. There was one special effect that I thought was pretty cool, to be honest, but it is such a small part in such a large act of the movie that I just was sitting there like, what the fuck are we doing? I'm glad it works for a lot of people, but when bad CGI just starts showing up, I tune out. I say, you know what, Luca, I think Challengers is still going to be my favorite movie of the year from you. There are certain sequences that makes it feel like an evolution from the guy that made Call Me By Your Name, but then there's other sequences where you're like, there's no shot in hell the guy that made Suspiria made this. And I would say by the time the credits rolled, I felt nothing. But like I said, I love the ending. I did feel something at which I was genuinely surprised by. So I'm not going to sit here and say that the movie doesn't work emotionally. And clearly, there's a lot of people that I know that love this movie. So it does work for a good amount of people out there. So I'm probably wrong. I hope you enjoy it. A lot of people think it's just as good as the rest of Luca's filmography. I just felt like I was feeling empty throughout a majority of the runtime. And if the rest of the movie was as good as those last 5 minutes, forget best of the year. We'd be talking best of the decade in terms of movies for me. And oh my God, we did it. We almost 3.5 hours of talking and editing and writing. It's actually insane. I'm very happy to deliver this level of quality for you. I couldn't have done it without Reed. Reed was a lifesaver for me this entire time. He was so patient with me. So thank you again, Reed. You're the man. Once again, Reed, plug your stuff down here. Hit him up if you need editing help. I apologize this took so long to get out. My life over the past 2 months has been a fun kind of hell. It's been busy. There's just been so many things in the works that I can't wait to share with you guys, but it took a while to get this done and out to a level that I wanted to, and it took much longer than I thought it would, but I'm very happy with what I've seen so far, and I'm sure Reed's going to kill this final part, and I can't wait for you to finally see it. So when it comes to the official ranking, I was debating if I should keep it the same as I went to the festival or update it a bit. Since it's been about 2 months since the festival ended, I ended up updating it a little bit. So some of these have moved up, some of them have moved down since I've rewatched them or thought about them a little bit more. What I am most confident about is my top 6 of the festival, with Heretic being my absolute favorite horror movie of the year and my favorite movie of TIFF. Then I would put Anora and Conclave at 2 and 3. The Fire Inside feels really good at 4. Presence and Friendship are kind of battling it out for the 5 spot, honestly, but if I had to give the edge to one of them, it would be Presence at the moment. And out of every movie I'm most interested in seeing a second time to see how my opinion changes, it's definitely The Brutalist. So thank you so much for sitting through my TIFF 2024 recap. We just talked about 37 movies in one video. That's kind of insane. And I just want to thank you again, you watching this video, for making this happen. I would never have been able to go to Toronto as press without you supporting the channel. It really means a lot to me. I can't wait to see where we are a year from now. If you haven't subscribed yet for whatever reason and you sat through me talking this entire time, I would hope that I sold you on subscribing to the channel at this point. But if not, no big deal. Just give the video a like. It would help me and Reed out a ton with helping me, hopefully getting to pay him to help me more in the future. Making this video taught me a lot for you guys. I'll probably change up something about my approach later, but one thing's for sure, I love the quality that we deliver for you, and that's the most important. But the TIFF 2024 Film Festival was seriously one of my favorite weeks in my life. I had always wanted to go. It was on the bucket list for forever. I met so many awesome people. I am planning to go back for not only next year, but the next couple years. So Toronto, if you like my video, I would love to come back. And I guess that's it for me. So this is Chase. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I hope you have an awesome day and an awesome holiday season. Thanks.